Well, let us begin. Welcome everyone to the reviews of the Enoch Seminar's presentation of the Oxford Handbook of the Apocrypha. My name is Joshua Scott, and I'm the interim chief editor of RES. On behalf of the Enoch Seminar, Oxford University Press, and our partner organizations, thank you for joining us today. The Oxford Handbook of the Apocrypha is a wonderful new reference work that introduces us to fresh research on the various texts labeled under the collective Apocrypha, as well as the major themes running across the collection. As a scholar of early Judaism, I appreciate the accessible layout and diverse biographical resources in each essay. Attention to such major themes as textuality, canon, worldview, and religion make this volume a great asset for the classroom. Thanks to our partnership with Oxford University Press, we are able to pass along a discount code for today's participants who would like to purchase this work. I will post this information in the chat in a few moments. Today's event is separated in two sessions. Session 1, scheduled for 11 a.m. to 12:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, will begin with an introduction by the volume's editor, Gerber Agema. And then we will hear from 4 contributors, Lorenzo DiTommaso, Kristin DeTroyer, John Kampen, and Sara Parks. We've asked these contributors to reflect on the finished volume, placing the articles and conversation together. With the time remaining in session 1, we will open the floor for discussion. In session 2, scheduled for 1 to 2:30 p.m., we will hear reviews from Esther Brownsmith and Brandon Hawk, followed by open discussion. I will chair session 1, and Gabriele Boccaccini, founding director of the Enoch Seminar, will chair session 2. We will keep Zoom open during the 30-minute break, so you're welcome to stay signed in to the meeting. We've imagined this event as a seminar with an atmosphere of collegial dialogue, and so we invite attendees to participate by means of Zoom's chat function. In addition, we also invite you to use the raised hand function during the open discussion portions of the event to indicate you'd like to join the conversation. We will call on you as time allows. We celebrate that we are joined today with people from around the globe for whom English is not their first language. To be as accessible as possible, I encourage all of the speakers to speak slowly so the automated transcription might communicate your speech. With those brief notes of introduction to our event, I now welcome Gerber Agema, the editor of this handbook, for the introduction to the project. Gerber, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for organizing this and for inviting everyone to contribute to a discussion about the Apocrypha. And of course, I start with thanking all the authors who have contributed to the handbook with updated and innovative contributions, without which this handbook would never have existed. And it was also a total pleasure to work with all of you. After my little introduction, some of the authors will go more into the specific aspects of the Apocrypha, but here I want to use the opportunity to raise a number of more general issues that have to do with how the Apocrypha fit in the context of early Judaism that has become such an important field of research. As such, the collection of the Apocrypha is a kind of very strange collection. What is the reason that we have the collection? Did the people 2,000 years ago select the writings for a specific reason because of maybe genre, of language, Greek, of contents, of thematics, or was it a more a part of Hellenistic Judaism that these writings were collected? The writings as such are not all related to each other in terms of content, so it is already an issue. Why were they collected? Now, the main reason why we have them is that they are part of the Septuagint. But the Septuagint has, of course, apart from being of a Jewish origin, it doesn't have a Jewish reception history. it is mostly received in the Christian churches. And there we have another remarkable issue, that most of the churches at some point decided to abandon the Apocrypha. That's why when I teach early Judaism, I always have to underline the fact that the students have to buy a Bible with the Apocrypha, because if you go to the bookstore, it normally isn't there. Yeah? So there are a number of issues around why were these books selected. But two of the main characters they are part of the Septuagint, and they come from Greco-Roman Judaism, most of them. Another aspect of the Apocrypha is that they mostly don't appear in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and mostly also not in the New Testament. Apart from a number of quotations, they are, so to say, representing a different stream within early Judaism. And maybe there were not too many connections between the various groups within Judaism. And then there is another aspect of the Apocrypha, and that is the reception history. We don't have one collection of Apocrypha. We have different canons with different numbers of apocryphal books. We also have reception history in art history and in music. So they have moved through the past 2,000 years in different ways and have therefore acquired different types of relevance. Now, if you come to the larger question of how the Apocrypha fitted within early Judaism, maybe one can differentiate between different stages in research on the Apocrypha. Let's say prior to the 1980s, when the Dead Sea Scrolls were only known to a select group of scholars, not to the wider audience, when the Pseudepigrapha were in great number not yet edited and translated, of course, the Apocrypha prior to the 1980s were, together with Philo and Josephus, the main sources of early Judaism, which in those days was, of course, called the Jewish background of the New Testament. Yeah, so the Apocrypha in the earlier history of research played an important role. Then from the 2000s onwards, when the Dead Sea Scrolls and most of the Pseudepigrapha were accessible, the focus of research switched much more to the Qumran scrolls, the Pseudepigrapha, and I think that's one of the reasons why the Apocrypha received a more peripheral place in research on early Judaism, which by then, of course, was already having different names than Jewish background of New Testament. Maybe in the 2020s, our own time, one could say, and that is just an hypothesis, that early Judaism is mostly perceived through the eyes of the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Pseudepigrapha, and much less through the eyes of the Apocrypha, which of course also translates in a very different perception of early Judaism, that of being very diverse, that of also much more of having an apocalyptic character, which of course has consequences for, as we had our Enoch seminar on Jesus and Paul last year, has consequences for how we perceive the New Testament. Yes, if we remember the conference on Paul is defined as Jewish and apocalyptic, but where do the Apocrypha fit in that? Then we have another set of questions, whether the Apocrypha as such represent one specific worldview, or let's say a kind of consistent worldview. Now, one of the problems is that the Apocrypha are not one specific genre, they are different genres, and within every individual apocryphon, we also have the use of different genres. So it's very difficult to connect a specific writing with an historical context if it is so diverse in the application of genres. Then there is another issue that the writings represent different points of view. So is there a common worldview, or maybe even a theology in the Apocrypha? I think it's very difficult to say that. So what then do they represent in terms of part of the early Judaism? And then finally, and that I think is one of the great values of the handbook, there are a number of overarching themes that have appeared in the recent history of research as very relevant, that were not covered in earlier treatments of the Apocrypha. There is, for example, a contribution about practices and beliefs, Jewish practices and beliefs in the Apocrypha, a very important contribution. Then we have an article about women and gender, which of course in the overall study of early Judaism has been a very neglected topic. So how do the Apocrypha deal with that? Now in a very diverse way. Then we have, of course, reception history, which is a very important aspect. Then there are various chapters on sexuality and ethics, which is another overarching theme. And then finally, as I already mentioned, as a question, which I think and which I hope will be the contribution of this handbook and seminars like this one, what is, so to say, the overall place of the Apocrypha in the study of early Judaism? And I hope that there will be more attention given to it in light of what I said before, that the perception we have of early Judaism has very much changed in the past 2 decades. So this much as a general introduction, and I'm looking forward to our discussions. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ger. We now welcome Lorenzo DiTommaso. Lorenzo, the floor is yours.
Thank you. As the first speaker among our distinguished panelists, I would like to call attention to some general points about the contribution of the new Oxford Handbook of the Apocrypha as an integrated volume. First, the handbook is timely. My personal library contains no less than 16 handbooks, guides, and encyclopedias on apocalyptic literature that have been published in English this century alone. By contrast, the Oxford Handbook of the Apocrypha is, I think, the first new comprehensive survey of the subject in English since David de Silva's 2004 introducing the Apocrypha. A major reason for the gap is that the books of the capital A Apocrypha are more usually covered alongside the classic pseudepigrapha, as Hebron has just indicated, or under the broader categories of either early Jewish literature or the lowercase a Apocrypha, as with Brandon Hawk's excellent introduction, also recently published. Second, the Oxford Handbook of the Apocrypha is relevant. I think that we are all aware that the major publishers, with the transition from print to digital that occurred about 10 or 15 years ago, saw in authoritative reference handbooks and guides a way to curb diminishing profits. Biblical scholars of a certain generation no doubt recall a time when there were only 24 or so weighty reference works that one really needed to know. Nowadays, it is difficult to keep up. As of yesterday, there are 1,265 Oxford handbooks, each devoted to a special subject. To this figure must be added an even greater number of analog titles from Cambridge, Routledge, Wiley-Blackwell, and other publishers. We now live, it seems, in the age of reference. How Baroque. My point is that many of these thousands of handbooks and guides deal with narrowly specific topics that will be of interest only to a few specialist scholars. Not so the Oxford Handbook of the Apocrypha. The Apocrypha are relevant to scholars of early Judaism, early Christianity, late antique Christianity, and in their reception of their contents, medieval Christianity, Judaism, Islam, and beyond, all the way to the contemporary age. The component texts of the volume of the Apocrypha span the literary spectrum from wisdom books and romances to histories, court tales, hymns, psalms, prayers, and apocalyptic literature. These texts are critically important to the study of canonicity, transmission, reception, rewriting, and the life and afterlife of biblical figures. They are important too for all those interested in gender studies, sexuality, halakha, ethics, Hellenistic Judaism, Christian origins, and far more. In short, the Oxford Handbook of the Apocrypha is relevant because its subject is relevant, cardinally so. This brings me to my third point about the value of the handbook as a volume. which is the influence of its editor, Hebron Ujima. The Apocrypha are relevant for all the reasons that I mentioned, and a comprehensive survey study of the subject may be long overdue. But it is the editor's hand that can make the difference between a good volume and a great one. This is a great volume. Hebron's steady editorial hand is evident throughout the volume, from its individual articles to its overall shape. The volume is structured around the component texts of the Apocrypha, which Hebron divides into 4 sections: historical and legendary, apocalyptic, didactic, and additions to biblical books. Each article represents a thoroughly up-to-date and in-depth introduction to a specific text, with the usual subsections on its contents, date and place of composition, and often the manuscript evidence, which I found to be a special bonus. Each article also contains one or more subsections that highlight the special aspects of the text, such as the ethical themes in Karina Martin Hogan's entries on Baruch, or the 4 subsections on wisdom in Jason Zarowski's entry on the wisdom of Solomon. These subsections connect the contemporary reader with the ancient texts in ways above and beyond the usual technical data. Hebron's editorial hand is also present in his wise decision to preface 3 of the 4 textual sections with special thematic articles. The first of these, Apocrypha, Genre, and Historicity, is written by Hebron himself and opens the section on the historical Apocrypha. My own paper on the Apocrypha and Apocalypticism and John Kampen's on Wisdom Literature of the Apocrypha preface those sections respectively. These papers add another broader layer of meaning to the specialist articles, allowing scholars to further contextualize their readings of, say, Baruch or the Wisdom of Solomon. Still another layer, and perhaps the greatest contribution of the volume above and beyond the high quality of its specialist articles, is rendered by the 10 entries that open and close the volume. 5 articles are located in its opening section, the Apocrypha in Judaism and Christianity, while 5 more are its closing section, major themes in the Apocrypha. The net result is a volume where sage editorial decisions at every level have created an overall product that is, in my opinion, deeper, greater, and more useful than the average handbook or guide. For junior scholars, the Oxford Handbook of the Apocrypha will become one of those indispensable reference volumes of old. For established volumes, it is a handy and reliable source that one can consult, especially to bring yourself up to date on a text that you might not have had occasion to read for a long time, as often happens. For all scholars, the handbook is a benchmark volume that is the starting point for the many topics under the wide umbrella of its subject. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lorenzo. We appreciate it. We'll now turn to Kristin DeTroyer. Kristin, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And I'm going to, can you hear me? Yes, sir?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. I'm going to share what I have prepared. I hope you can see it. I have to just slideshow from the start. Okay, do you see my right screen, the correct screen? I hope so.
We do. Thank you.
Perfect. Yes. I first would like to thank Ger and Josh for allowing us to participate in this handbook. I think it's a good handbook, and I'm very happy that we were allowed to do so. I would like to follow up on what Lorenzo just said. Lorenzo gave us a superb survey of the history and the present state of all kinds of reference works and our special handbook and its special place that it takes in this larger context of reference books. And whereas everything good has been said, I would like to focus now on one specific book and show how this book is important for me and how the issues that we dealt with in this book can play a role also for other Apocrypha. So as already said by Lorenzo, there are 3 parts in this volume. The 3 parts are on your screen, and giving you the nice subsections of all the Apocrypha and the books that are used. We, that means I and Tyler Smith, my colleague here in Salzburg, have been working on the additions to biblical books, more specifically, the additions to the Greek books of Esther. And I think it's very fitting to do that today, as today is Purim. So we read the scroll yesterday, and today we celebrate Purim. Hag Purim Sameach for those that celebrate. Let me just recall for those that are present the issue that is at stake with the additions to Esther. Normally the book of Esther, the scroll of Esther, has 10 chapters. The Old Greek text of Esther has 10 chapters plus 6 additions. There's also, very strangely, a second Greek text, which we commonly call the Alpha text, which is in itself a little bit shorter than the Old Greek text, but still has the 6 additions to it. I have to warn people that start working with Esther, the numbering system, both of the additions and of the text, is not easy, but it takes some time to find the right section in every kind of the books. It's a bit shorter, but actually the second Greek text is more or less the same, aside from chapters 7, 8, 9. 9 is very minimal, and 10 is also slightly rewritten. So we have one volume, a Hebrew text, and 2 different Greek texts. Now, when I look at these additions, right, there is something special to the additions of Esther. We have in the Apocrypha books that are where we still have at least a Hebrew pendant. For instance, in the book of Sirach, where we have, thanks to Qumran, now the finds of the Hebrew text there. But when we look at the additions, so apocryphal additions to text where there is no Hebrew counterpart, some of these additions, if I look at Psalms, for instance, we see that Psalms 151 to 155 are at the end of the Psalms. Similarly, we find, for instance, the book of Baruch or the Epistle of Jeremiah at the end of the book of Baruch, which comes after Lamentations and after Jeremiah. But when we look at Daniel and Esther, we see that the additions, the typical apocryphal additions to the text, are spread out throughout the volume. So we have additions at the beginning, at the end, and in between the texts and the text itself of Esther. So when we study apocryphal text, the place and the place of the additions plays a role, because the place of the additions has an influence on the function of the additions in the text. So where do the additions, the so-called apocryphal additions, where have they been added into the text? Now, for all these additions, so for me, the additions of Esther specifically, we have a specific set of problems connected with these texts. Namely, in which language were these additions produced? Were they produced in Greek? Were they produced in Hebrew or Aramaic? And we don't have a simple answer for that when it comes to the book of Esther and its additions. Second problem that I saw and Tyler and I worked on is, in which other languages do we have witnesses to these old Greek additions? For instance, in the Georgian text, we have the additions to the book of Esther as well. So what kind of witnesses do we have for these so-called deuterocanonical or apocryphal additions? The big question, where do these additions come from? Is the translator responsible? The translator, because with Esther, don't forget, we have a Hebrew text which was translated and the additions were added. But who added these additions, right? Who added 6 sections of text and plunged them into the chapters at the beginning, at the end, and in the middle of the book of Esther? And is a translator responsible for that, or did the translator find these additions somewhere in Greek literature? And then, what is the function? Why were they inserted into the text? What is the specific function of additional texts that we only find in the so-called apocryphal texts? And these problems are very similar for lots of the books that we deal with, lots of the apocryphal books. Especially when we don't have an entire book like Sirach, Judith, and Tobit. So, wrong there. It's the problem with Esther and the editions is different from the books of Sirach, Judith, and Tobit, because our editions are not complete editions. I mean, they are complete, but it's not a complete book like the book of Sirach or the book of Judith or the book of Tobit. We have editions that are partly looking like Hebrew texts in origin, and then we have editions of which we can say that they are surely Greek. So how do we balance these editions? The discussion, for instance, on the book of Judith is important because scholars have been saying, well, this was a translation. Jerome had been saying this is a translation of Hebrew Aramaic. Others say, like Barbara Schmitz and Engel, no, the whole book is a Greek composition. So for the book of Esther, we have a double problem, namely that part of it is in Hebrew and part of it comes in Greek. Another element that plays a role on our editions, apocryphal editions, is Qumran research. Qumran research has influenced our views on Sirach and Tobit, but unfortunately, it didn't do much for Esther. We have some quotations, however, and that's a link that I would like to underline. When we are dealing with Qumran texts, we also have to look at quotations of deuterocanonical and apocryphal texts. So for me, that's quite important to see what kind of text was known in Qumran. Esther was so-called not found in Qumran, but we do have references to the Hebrew text of Esther, not to the Greek text. The most important piece for us is, in the book of Esther, Jerome added a section of text. He wrote his own note, and he writes in that note, quae habentur in Hebraeo plena fide expressi, haec autem quae sequuntur scripta reperi in editione vulgata, quae Graecorum lingua et litteris continentur, et interim post finum libri hoc capitulum feribatur, quod juxta consuetudinem nostram obero, it es vero prenotavimus. What there is in Hebrew, says Jerome, I translated faithfully. Those writings, however, that follow, which were expressed in Greek language and script, I have found in the common edition. Subsequently, this part was moved to the end of the current book, and this was according to our custom marked with an obolus, which is a dagger. This little note, which is found after 10.3 in the Vulgate, Latin translation of Jerome, is important because it shows us precisely what our problem is. We have additions to a book that existed in Hebrew, and these additions come in Greek language and script. And our Jerome also says that he marked them with an obolus, which is a dagger. So we see here that already from the time of Jerome onwards, we have this problem of how do we mark these texts? How do we make clear to the reader that these texts were not originally in the Hebrew text? And I think that has an influence on the history of text criticism. And there we see Jerome as a text critic at work. So with my additions, I have a problem of numbering and labeling. I have the appearances in other witnesses. How do I deal with that? But for me, most importantly, how are these apocryphal editions linked to the rest of the Greek text? This is an additional problem that we have only with books where there are additions. It's not a problem that occurs in Judith or not a problem that occurs in Sirach, but how do the additions of the book of Esther relate to the Greek text of the book of Esther? Was the author who added, or the translator who added these additions, did that same person or another person make changes in the translation of the Hebrew text as well? So for me, that's a very important question. And then for me, also important is, which Greek text, to which Greek text were these additions added? And which ones are Greek and which ones are partly in Hebrew or were partly in Hebrew? And how did these additions influence the rest of the text? So for me, there's a lot of problems connected with the book of Esther and with the book of Esther, the additions to the book of Esther. And these questions are the kind of problems or questions that we ought to ask for the rest of the Apocrypha. And that brought me to write that, given these questions, I wrote a second article at the beginning of the volume. It's the beginning of the volume, and it was called The Apocrypha, the Septuagint, and Other Greek Witnesses. And why did I want to add that section? Because I wanted to give a survey on the Greek manuscripts in which one can find the Apocrypha, or at least what we traditionally call the Apocrypha. Which codex? And here Alexandrinus is quite important. I also noted that we have to start looking more into the evidence of the papyri. Don't forget that the Greek editions as produced by the Göttingen Septuaginta-Unternehmen are dated, and we need to see again and more closely what papyri have been discovered and what do they tell us. For me also, which other books can be connected with the Greek text and offer other apocrypha? How do we learn to work with the Göttingen Verzeichnis? How do we learn to work with a survey where we see not only per book, but can we see witnesses in which the Greek text of Esther is connected with other apocryphal texts? So not having a small view on one volume singularly, but how do we make that larger? Which volumes contained which manuscripts contained which apocryphal books? And then the question, which books can now be found in Hebrew and Aramaic? And for that reason, I always consult DGD 39. So when looking at Apocrypha, look at what we have in the Greek side and in the Göttingen side, and look at what we have in the Qumran side. Another question that started emerging in my research on Apocrypha is, which texts do they represent? We quite often say, well, they come in Greek, but which Greek text? Do we have the Greek text, or is it an Old Greek text? Or in the case of the Georgian and Syriac first Baruch, is it the Lucianic text? Yeah, so what kind of text do we refer to? It's not longer sufficient to say that these texts were found in Greek. We have to specify which Greek text, Old Greek, Lucianic, or, as in the case of Daniel, what other Greek text is there? Do we work with the Old Greek text or the Theodosian text? This question influences then the discussion about the possible Hebrew underlying text. If we say that we have a Lucianic text, then we have to realize that the Lucianic text is normally a recension towards a Hebrew text. But what do we say if there is no Hebrew text? Similarly, when we say it's a Theodosionic Greek text, again, that's a recension normally looking to a Hebrew text, but which Hebrew text? And I also want to include in this discussion the Vulgate and its link with the Vetus Latina. So when we're talking about apocryphal text and we want to come up with a survey of the historical development of these texts, we have to ask questions about the possible voorlages and how the recensional character of these books can be seen. Overall, we have to study the context in which these apocryphal books occurred. If there is a specific theology per book, we have to define it and ask the question, where did this text come from? What is the place of origin? There are many interesting topics connected with Apocrypha, and we have to start using them really as part of Second Temple literature, or more intensively, because I think we already have been doing that. So now I come to the last slide. I would like to thank again Gerber and Josh for having allowed us to participate in collaborating on this truly nice volume. And I hope to see you all at the SPL International meeting in July in Salzburg. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. You raised a number of significant issues I hope we can continue to talk about. Next, I'll call upon John Kampen. John, could you unmute, please? The floor is yours, John. John, could you unmute, please?
I'm sorry. My congratulations to Gerber and all of the contributors in Oxford University Press on this magnificent volume. It's a pleasure to see such a carefully crafted project come to fruition in such a splendid publication. It will serve us and our field well as a reference work to which we can refer our inquisitive colleagues teaching and researching in allied fields, as an introductory work to be consulted on a regular basis by our students. It also is an important work for us who are researching and teaching in the field, as it provides us with a good evaluation of the present state of study on each of the individual works in the collection. Its very particular contribution to our field is the attempt to look at broader issues related to our comprehension and study of this particular collection of texts. The concluding section, Major Themes in the Apocrypha, is a valuable addition to the field, since it gives us information about the connections between the various works, helping us to probe those issues more deeply. And I'd want to endorse Lorenzo's wonderful summary of the contributions that this volume makes in the context of other contributions. One of the most, and I'm going to just highlight a few questions that I think emerge from this particular volume. One of the interesting features of the evaluations of many of the compositions in this collection is the argument for the literary unity of each composition. I am not certain that there has ever been a time in the past 2 centuries of research on these works that this has been the case. Whether this will still be considered to be the case 50 years from now is anybody's guess. But it does represent a crucial development in the field. What makes this such an interesting development is that it coincides with a time when there has never been a greater degree of uncertainty regarding the genre classifications we bring to the identification and study of these same texts. For example, the uneasy conversation about wisdom and apocalyptic has proceeded unabated since the release of the entire corpus of materials from Qumran in 1991, and has its origins in the debate about apocalyptic a few decades earlier. Discussion of the definitions of each also are in flux, perhaps more pronounced with regard to the identification of wisdom in the last decade. One way of identifying the issue is that these texts are considered to be unified literary compositions which include material from a variety of genres, when the latter is defined according to traditional classifications. In my article on wisdom, I once again was called upon to recognize the poverty of our classifications. Within their compositions, the authors of these texts convey a holistic view of the world, the universe, and humanity, and also the manner in which the individuals or groups who wish to do so can attain an understanding of the particular viewpoints advanced, as well as the consequences of that knowledge for how they should live their lives. To stretch the boundaries of our literary considerations for a moment, for the purpose of illustration, there are similarities between instruction, substantial portions of 1 Enoch, and even Ben Sira, which distinguish them from a basic wisdom text such as Proverbs and point to a certain unity of perception. Leaving aside the question of Ben Sira for a moment, we can also see a similarity between Daniel, 1 Enoch, instruction, mysteries, and other fragmentary texts from the Qumran corpus, which makes the distinction between 1 Enoch as an apocalyptic text and instruction as a wisdom text appear somewhat arbitrary. DiTommaso suggests we add wisdom of Solomon to that list as well, and Zarowski's analysis points in a similar direction. His consideration of ambiguity as central to the composition requires more consideration on my part in light of the connections I've just mentioned. Elsewhere, I have demonstrated the manner in which vocabulary related to knowledge and wisdom is also central to the rules text as well. Work such as this handbook should urge us to investigate in a more thorough manner the ideological or theological complex which lies at the center of these intersections and builds upon their common elements. Perhaps I'm only dreaming. This volume builds upon the very helpful and highly problematic collection of literature called the Apocrypha, and Gerben already alluded to this in his introductory remarks. For those of us who teach in environments where the majority of students are of Christian background or persuasion, this particular collection is valuable to demonstrate that the world of Second Temple Judaism has been regarded as having some significance in Christian history. This handbook has an excellent set of comprehensive articles as well as surveys and introductions of individual works to bring medium level and advanced students into a deeper exploration of that world. Part 1 on the Apocrypha in Judaism and Christianity is a unique collection of articles in our handbooks and companion volumes on various aspects of Second Temple studies. It provides a helpful overview of the collection's reception history from various standpoints. Many of us have selected pieces of this reception history on our computers to be trotted out in our teaching and research when convenient. This section of the volume helps us take this dimension seriously. Due to its canonical status, that reception history is both more extensive and more complicated than for some other Second Temple literature. But the collection called the Apocrypha has its limitations with regard to how it functions in the study of Second Temple. While Egema has provided a very valuable listing of text collections, translations, bibliographies, and introductions in his introduction, I find some elements missing, and I think it is a clue to what is missing more widely in the volume, perhaps more so in our study of this literature. I've been using Seth Schwartz's The Ancient Jews from Alexander to Mohammed in classes where I feel I have time for a historical introduction. This, of course, is an abridgment and extension of his earlier Imperialism and Jewish Society, 200 BCE to 604 CE, to 640 CE. I recognize his work is not everybody's cup of tea. Other works such as Chaim Lapin's The Rabbis as Romans could also be considered. The use of Schwartz, to my mind, serves two purposes. It helps my students realize that the Second Temple period and even the early Roman period are only chapters in an ongoing and continuous Jewish history. For most of them, this places the reading of these texts in a different perspective than those developed from life in communities with a limited or no active Jewish presence and who have had no exposure to the classical Jewish texts. The second purpose it serves is to bring them into conversation with good critical scholarship on the issues attendant to the study of the history of Rabbinic Judaism. Regardless of one's historical evaluation of the rabbinic texts as to their value for the study of Second Temple life, they are important for our study, and students not familiar with Jewish history need to understand this. In this case, the Apocrypha as a collection has by definition a reception history in Christian history. But all of the ideas, some of the compositions, and many of the social movements of Second Temple life that are part of the world in which the books of the Apocrypha were written have a reception history within Jewish life as well. In this volume, Zaltzbach, in her article on Jewish religion, provides examples of continuity of practice. However, here the contribution is categorized as a theme rather than as a portion of reception history. The way we define our field limits our attempt to understand its literature and its history in a comprehensive manner. This is not a comment on the nature of the articles themselves in this volume. The choice of contributors and the articles they produced are outstanding. I confronted the limitations of the work in the Apocrypha in my article on wisdom literature of the Apocrypha and related compositions of the Second Temple era. It was a little embarrassing when I opened up the published volume and saw that I was the only one who had such a long title, even though Carla Salzbach came close. I'm grateful to Egma, a wise and knowledgeable editor, for accepting my rewording of the original assignment. I could not develop an adequate portrayal of this literature based solely upon Sirach and the wisdom of Solomon. These works and their significance can only be understood within a broader view of the nature and significance of the sapiential literature and related concepts of that era, already partially demonstrated above. It does, to my mind, provide a good example of the limitations of the Apocrypha as a source for the study of Second Temple Jewish life. My congratulations once again to Gerber and all of the contributors who have provided us with an excellent volume, thought-provoking if we take all that is within it seriously.
Thank you very much, John. We'll now turn to Sara Parks. Sara, you have the floor.
Thank you, Josh. Can everyone hear me okay?
We can.
Thanks for the invitation to share my reflections on this gorgeous and rich new Oxford Handbook of the Apocrypha. I promise that I have not only read every chapter, but indeed every footnote, because before the volume went to press, I volunteered to provide a light copy edit. At the time, I was freshly graduated, precariously employed, teaching a full load of new material, had some hefty admin responsibilities, supervising my first postgraduate students, and working endlessly on job applications. What kind of circumstance would give rise to someone in that particular situation volunteering for an additional task? The circumstances have everything to do with the volume's editor. I want to make use of my time today to shine a spotlight on him. Gerber Ugama takes the limelight very infrequently. As soon as he gets a moment on center stage, he's quick to shift the attention onto his students and colleagues with generosity and enthusiasm. I'm happy for a chance to return the favor and let this group know a bit about the type of doctoral supervisor he is. It is a rule of thumb that it's better to show rather than tell. So instead of just claiming that Gerber is a generous, open-minded, encouraging, and humble scholar and colleague, I will tell 3 stories. Story number 1. Some of you have heard this one before. I arrived at McGill to begin my master's, having never set foot in a big Canadian city and never been exposed to academia beyond a BA in a tiny, rural, evangelical institution. I was, to put it mildly, somewhat naive. An illustration of how naive I was is that I planned to do my MA thesis on homosexuality in the Bible, whereby I would single-handedly redeem the Christian Bible from bigotry, without a clue that my questions spanned several different disciplines and overly vast time periods, not to mention issues of approach. Instead of berating this plan, Dr. Ugama uttered one of the words he uses most frequently: wonderful. Next, he lent me his copy of Bernadette Bruton's Love Between Women. He said a good first step would be to read it from cover to cover. Of course, by the time I was finished the book, I had an eye-opening lesson in method. Gerberin led by positively showing rather than negatively telling. Story number 2. In the meantime, I was enrolled in the class that would end up determining my research interests. It was Gerberin's postgraduate seminar called Greco-Roman Judaism. He is somewhat evangelical about the Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha and frequently gains converts. This class set me on the path to switch from New Testament to early Judaism for my PhD and to focus on gender, somewhat against my will at first. It was there that I read First Maccabees for the first time and became obsessed. I was strongly considering a Judas Maccabeus tattoo. Gerberin joked to the class that I was an excellent reminder of how sophisticated and skilled our ancient authors were, because their rhetoric had clearly worked on me even 2,000 years later. I knew I wanted to write on 1st and 2nd Maccabees for that class essay, but I was having difficulty narrowing my topic. Gerberin suggested that I focus on the role of women in the 2 books. I dismissed the suggestion because I deemed gender studies to be a distracting niche, and I wanted to do real scholarship. But when I couldn't find another topic and the deadline approached, I reluctantly began to investigate the women in both books. The resulting research was again eye-opening. I learned that there is no way to study ancient women without also uncovering answers to many other kinds of questions, and the essay expanded into my MA thesis. In fact, some of that research made its way into my contribution to the handbook we're celebrating today, the chapter on women and gender. Throughout the rest of my studies, Gerberin continued to remind me to consider gender, constantly asserting that the women figures of the Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha represented largely unexplored evidence, and the lens of gender had yet to be applied to much of the extra-canonical literature. Today, I owe many of my academic achievements not only to the endless stream of reference letters that Gerberin has written annually for me for years, but to his encouragement to embrace new approaches and to specialize in a then underexplored and undervalued field. This brings me to story number 3. Gerberin was awarded at least 2 major Canadian funding packages from the SSHRC, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, while I was his student. He received funding to investigate the visual reception history of the Apocrypha and the modern relevance of non-canonical early Jewish texts, among other things. These funding applications, as you know, are voluminously time-consuming and brutally competitive. They are primarily used by Canadian senior academics to buy relief from teaching and go off, free from students, to write one's books. Instead, Gerberin treated these major funding packages primarily as a way of providing PhD funding to students. In other words, he primarily directed his own hard-won research funds towards giving students steady paychecks in exchange for very little work besides our own research. PhDs in religious studies at McGill are typically unfunded and must work on the side or get government student loans. I'm not sure Ger has ever been publicly acknowledged for this, but from what I can tell, he spent little from these grants on himself and instead used them to set as many of us up as research assistants as he could, affording us many opportunities. I fondly remember the time he subsidized a research trip for half a dozen students to spend time in Florence exploring visual representations of characters from the Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha. It was on that trip that my obsession changed from the Maccabees to Tobias and Sarah. Research from that trip also made its way into my handbook chapter. I'm not sure whether the other PhD students were aware that GARE's use of funding was not the norm, but it was extraordinarily generous. Of course, this generosity continues as we only have to skim the table of contents of this Oxford Handbook and find among senior names in the field, such as Lester Grab, Kristin DeTroyer, William Loader, Doron Mendels, and several others, the names of Gerbairn's students and other students and early career scholars, such as myself, Shana Scheinfeld, Carla Sulzbach, Matthew Korpman, and more. These three stories come together to explain why I volunteered to copy edit the project. Gerbairn's mentorship and collegiality creates an atmosphere of mutual encouragement and mutual generosity to the extent that I, and I'm sure many others, come away with a lifelong gratitude and eagerness to pay back in some small way his plentiful kindnesses. Now, so that this is not 100% encomium, I will turn my attention to the volume itself and specifically to my own chapter. I want to point out that mutual generosity between early career scholars and senior scholars is not the only mode of operation possible. And dare I say, not even the most common mode. Other modes of interaction between senior and junior scholars that I have seen range from outright rivalry to dismissal of, or even oblivion to, the other. And this latter goes in both directions. I've once or twice even caught glimpses of slight tensions between senior and junior cohorts at meetings of the Enoch Seminar. During these years of growing pains, as Gabriele and others have made an effort to throw open the Enoch Seminar's doors to bring in voices that have traditionally struggled at the margins of early Jewish, early Christian, and early Islamic studies. Such tensions gave rise to the structure of my piece on women and gender in the Apocrypha. I wanted to embody that spirit of generosity and bridge building modeled by our editor, so I chose to spend a third of the piece harking back with gratitude to senior giants in the field, making clear that it is upon their foundations we newer scholars inevitably build, even as we apply new theoretical frameworks and question former assumptions. Before bringing in Sarah Ahmed, Avram Rochek, Nyasha Jr., and others who work with more intersectional theories of gender, I include a substantial section called The Last 50 Years, 3 Developmental Stages. Here I pay homage to methodological pioneers like Ross Kramer, Bernadette Bruton, and Tal Ilan, who pushed gender and feminist studies to decenter canon and incorporate non-literary evidence. Phyllis Tribble, who helped move us beyond the female protagonist phase of scholarship, daring to conclude that the roles of women in the texts of Jewish and Christian antiquity are sometimes totally irredeemable from a feminist or any ethical standpoint. Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza for her meticulous working out over a long career of an ethics of historical scholarship, her provision of indispensable new concepts and language, and from her place of senior white Christian privilege to work actively against anti-Jewish interpretations. Only after acknowledging my debt to the labor of these ancestors do I devote the second section to new scholarship on primary texts, especially Judith, additions to Esther, Susanna, and the unnamed mother in 2nd Maccabees. I will end this talk with a snapshot, or I actually end my piece in the article with a snapshot of where we are today. And so I'd like to just read a snippet from it. It includes some desiderata for the future. It says, the study of women and gender in the Apocrypha has moved through various stages, beginning with an interest in drawing attention to female characters. moving through the formulation of distinct methods for women's history, culminating in our current focus on theory and a diversification of scholarship. We now tend more often to incorporate theoretical groundwork from the interdisciplinary study of gender, including of masculinities. Recent work has also recognized and worked to correct a lack of diversity among those who approach ancient Jewish texts from feminist perspectives. The next stage in this and other fields will occur when the lens of gender is no longer compartmentalized as a modular side topic that can be ignored without consequence. Rather, gender-aware analysis will be part and parcel of all reputable scholarship, end quote. The authoritative tone and audacious confidence of that last line is the mark of an early career scholar whose work has been met at every hurdle, at every writer's block, and at every case of fraud syndrome with a supervisor who simply says, "This is wonderful." Well, I reflect that sentiment back to Ger, and I want to thank him and all of my fellow contributors for what is indeed a wonderful contribution to the field.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And thank you in general to all of our panelists. I really appreciate how you've picked out certain points of the volume to accentuate in your presentations. And thank you, Ger. I would reflect Sarah's comments. We've appreciated your contributions to the Enoch seminar, as well as the collegiality that's represented by this volume. So thank you for your work. We'll now move to open discussion among the panelists and all participants. We invite you to use the raised hand feature if you'd like to contribute on screen, or if you'd prefer to remain off screen, we invite you to put your comments in the chat. While we invite people, while people consider what they would like to say, I wanted to pose a question that was inspired by Lorenzo's closing of his article. He poses a couple of observations, and I found his questions at the end very insightful. I ended up sitting with them for a while. And I'll read these questions out loud as it starts. Does the absence of the apocalyptic worldview, ubiquity of the Deuteronomic pattern among the pre-Roman apocryphal writings, shed light on the reasons for their unique presence in the ancient Greek Bibles? In other words, is there a relationship between the internal homogeneity of these writings and their external integrity as the set of writings that appear in one version of the Jewish scriptures, but not the other? The social terrain of the Greek-speaking Jewish communities was amenable to the Deuteronomic pattern, as noted, but it was also less suited to the apocalyptic speculation, at least during this early period. I found that a really interesting thought about what actually unites these texts. We talk about canon, we can talk about groupings. I appreciated Lorenzo's comments here, as well as other articles that also talk about ideological connections or religious connections or social connections. I'm curious about whether we could talk about a single occupation or focus of the text beyond these canonical distinctions. So many of the articles offered, I thought, some really interesting suggestions about their combination, their unity. And so I wanted to pose that a question, but also to Lorenzo specifically, since you asked, I thought, these really interesting, insightful observations at the end. Now that we have this volume, are we closer to talking about a unity of occupation or focus among the collection of texts?
It's a very good question. Let me preface my answer by saying that this was a strange contribution. Hebron had asked me to write the entry on the additions to Daniel, which I did. It was a technical article. And then he raised the subject, which I admittedly never considered. We're colleagues here, as you know, in Montreal, And we were having coffee at our favorite spot, and he raised the topic of apocalypticism and Apocrypha. And I'd never really thought about it because those two things really didn't work in my mind, other than Fourth Ezra, which is of course Second Ezra 3:14, and maybe the a later text, as I explained in my entry. And the more I thought about it, I started thinking the same way that you're doing, which is, well, why not? You know, what's the problem? And you know, if it, as John Kampen rightly said, we're saddled with definitions. You know, definitions not only provide the portal of entry into a specific corpus, but define that corpus and also describe what actually constitutes as evidence, right? So in some ways, we have our evidence in front of us, which is determined by the lens through which we look at all this stuff. And you know, I took Hebron's question and I thought about it for a long time. And some of you know that I prefer to see things apocalyptic or apocalyptic phenomenon, or whatever it may be, not in terms of a literary genre, not in terms of the revelation of heavenly mysteries, not in terms of this, that, or the other thing, but really as a fundamentally expression of a concrete and well-defined worldview, which, if identified properly, as I think it can be, isolates it from other types of worldviews and is able to identify apocalyptic phenomena, not only in early Judaism and Christianity, but elsewhere. And just as equally important, to identify things that aren't apocalyptic, and for these reasons why. And so having thought about that and having approached it with that way, through that lens, the lens of the worldview, and again, realizing that no approach and no portal of entry and no model can answer every question. That's just, nothing works that way. But in this case, all of a sudden, it was almost as if I was looking at dots of all different sorts of colors, and I put a filter in front of these dots, and all of a sudden, most of these dots all became shades of one color. It didn't mean that they were connected in other ways. I'm not saying that at all. But what I did see was this striking absence of an apocalyptic worldview in the apocryphal books of the pre-Roman era. And wondered why. And then I started digging through, and I won't go through my article because my observations are there. To answer your question specifically, I wrote more than Gavin asks me to. And as others have said, I mean, Gavin is a very, very good editor, and he lets authors have their way. He keeps them on a long leash, so it keeps them on topic. But at that point, I couldn't answer the question. I'm not gonna cop out here and say, well, I had the answer. I didn't have another 9,000 words to write it. I don't know the answer. But it occurred to me, and I'm just sort of repeating your question right now. It occurred to me that maybe the answer to that question of the lack of any representation of the apocalyptic revolution that occurred in the second quarter of the 2nd century BCE, and was transformative to Judaism, but not universally so, as it is to Christianity, which from inception is an apocalyptic religion. However you defined inception, pre or post Easter, is up to you, but ultimately that's what it is. Was there something in the social ecology of these texts, or maybe a common social ecology, that made it the social terrain less likely to harbor the seeds of the apocalyptic worldview? And I think maybe the diasporic setting, which is reified in so many of the court tales, both in the Hebrew Bible, in the Masoretic text, and in the Greek versions, that may also be an example of what I'm talking about. I don't want to go on, but I just wanted to sort of flesh out what I was trying to get out there. I don't know the answer. I was asking really questions.
And I thought they were really great questions. Like I said, I sat with them for a while after reading your article and really appreciated them. I opened that question up to the other presenters as well, or if there's other threads that we wish to pursue. But it seems like most of the articles in some way deal with this question. I really appreciated you framed it as worldview. Kristin, for example, talked about it in relations of textual relationships in the ancient world. And so I posed that question.
I think it's a good question, but I'm not sure how to, I mean, I don't have an answer neither, but it's a question that occurs also in the book of Esther, because there we have edition A and edition F that looks apocalyptic, but is not really apocalyptic. And so the question is there also like, is there an influence? Is there not an influence? Can we, is it in the context? Is it in the broader world? I mean, and I'm not saying that it is apocalyptic, but there are a lot of things that make me think it's apocalyptic. So I'm not sure whether these genres have been redefined. I'm also always very hesitant to see broad lines. I have to say I'm very hesitant because we don't sometimes not know where it has been produced. I mean, Esther produced where? I mean, we have a colophon. Okay, is the colophon written in Jerusalem? Is it to a book that was translated in Jerusalem? Was it brought to Egypt? Is it translated in Egypt? I mean, we don't know. And then the whole thing even explodes with my second Greek text, which I put completely in Rome. So it's like, what was there? The only thing I do know is that, wow, are we lucky that we work in this kind of material? I mean, how boring is it if you only work in Hebrew Bible pure, right? So we are the lucky ones because we are the ones that have to look into Greek context and then like reinterpretations of ancient Near Eastern mythologies in Greek literature, and how is the link, and do I find it in Greek, do I find it in the Hebrew, do I find it in these mixed texts? I mean, I love it. I mean, I couldn't be happier in this field because of the so many specific angles. What kind of groups do we have? What kinds of communities do we have? And how are all these kind of communities reflected in that many different sorts of groups? Maccabee, I mean, first Maccabee, second Maccabee, Esther, Tobit, completely different. So questions of diaspora, questions of home. What is home? What's a nation? I mean, wow. Sorry, maybe I'm now a little bit over enthusiastic about my own field, but it's on the one side the plurality of concepts, you're forced to work and to answer a lot of questions, and then at the end of the day, or at the end of 20 years, you say, I still don't know. I still don't know. Yes, but for that, I'm very happy. Like, then comes Sara along, and Sara says, well, I've got a new perspective, and Sara goes on another perspective. So I think in a lot of these things, we learn actually, it's as if we are studying Bible, we start focusing, and at the end, it's like a second naivete where you first ask the wolves to go out of the house, and you do anything to move the wolves away from your house, and then at the end you say, well, maybe I have to put the door open and let them back in. So you make a specialization, or you go into focus, and then at the end you realize that you can only answer the question by broadening up this perspective and taking into consideration a lot of other material. Sorry, that was my not so short answer.
Yes, if I may say something too, and I'm quoting Sara, quoting me, this is wonderful. Wonderful, because first of all, Joshua picks out the most central question. And I think Lorenzo's article is very, very precise in giving us direction where we should look at without yet knowing the answer. I think one of the specific elements or aspects of the Apocrypha is indeed that there is so little apocalypticism in it, except for 4th Ezra, which is really much later and actually doesn't fit in the Apocrypha. And I also agree with Kristin that we have the best job on earth with dealing with these materials. And for me personally, the major question for the next 10 years of research is, how do the Apocrypha fit within early Judaism, given all the research on the Dead Sea Scrolls and apocalypticism? And I think part of the answer why there is no apocalypticism in the Apocrypha is because we have come to believe that early Judaism is mostly an apocalyptic, representing an apocalyptic worldview. And I think this is only since the 1980s, because prior to that, I don't think earlier scholars saw it like that. They saw it very differently. Yeah. Anyways, to conclude, I think we should organize a conference about it. Anyways.
Yeah, I will speak for Gabriele in the Enoch seminar and saying that this sounds like a really interesting topic, that I'm sure there would be interest in hosting the meeting. Gabriele, what do you think about this book? I'm happy that you were able to join us after your other commitments. I know that you were absent for some of the presentations.
Sorry,
what do you think?
I could join only 20 minutes ago because I had another conference this morning in Italian conference. So no, very interesting. Kampen, I'm very interested in the discussion about how we should study this material today, because for me, it's, I mean, apart from the content of this volume, I'm very interested in knowing your opinion, not only you, I mean, of the entire group that authored this volume. Some suggestion how we should study today the Apocrypha, this corpus. Because I remember I attended some of the conferences that Geza Zeravitz organized on the Apocrypha, which was an incredible, beautiful series of conferences and books and volumes on the subject of Apocrypha. I mean, we all recognize that this is important material, and I agree with you, Gern, that maybe we have neglected some of these texts because they are not apocalyptic. Okay, it's possible. On the other hand, I remember we had already this kind of discussion of should we study this material as an autonomous corpus, or this doesn't make any sense in the context of Second Temple Judaism because they never existed as a separate corpus until they were made a separate corpus much later. So how can we reintroduce the study of this text, knowing that this text at the beginning had little in common. I mean, because they are a corpus that was not written by a single movement. They were not written by in a single geographical or in a single chronological setting. So, and I remember in the last conference that we had in Budapest, and also John Collins was there. The question was should we still talk about Old Testament Apocrypha, or should we completely abolish this category in the study of Second Temple, of the Second Temple period? This could be applied for any other corpus in Second Temple period. I mean, what is the meaning of talking of Hebrew Bible in the study of Second Temple Judaism, or even Dead Sea Scrolls or Old Testament Pseudepigrapha, when these are modern corpora, are not collections or are that were the expression of particular groups, etc. So for me, the central question remains, how can we introduce the study of the Apocrypha in the contemporary study of Second Temple Judaism? So what is the best strategy? Because I am fully convinced that this is material that is often neglected for canonical reasons, okay? Maybe also because they are not apocalyptic. So we have a lot of problems why these texts are not used. So we have to reintroduce the study of this text in the study of Second Temple Judaism. My question, and this is the question I really have for the entire group, what is the best way of doing it now? Okay, apart from writing, of course, an introduction to Second Temple, to the Old Testament Apocrypha, which is perfectly fine. But what is your suggestion? I mean, what do you expect? I mean, for instance, for us, of Enoch seminar, how should we try to reintroduce the study of this material in the broader study of because I mean, like with the pseudepigraph of the Old Testament, we cannot develop a theology of the Old Testament Apocrypha, or a theology of the pseudepigrapha, just side by side with the theology of Hebrew Bible. These are, I mean, because the field is includes, must be inclusive. So, and again, I repeat, how can we study this material? How can we really stress and invite all our colleagues to study this material in a proper way without taking this material apart from the Second Temple Jewish literature? Then, of course, the study of how the Old Testament Apocrypha became the Old Testament Apocrypha. This is an important chapter in reception history. I've also written something on this. How this text became the Apocrypha. Okay, this is an incredibly important chapter, but this has to do not with the Second Temple period, but has to do with the development of Christianity, the controversy between the Hebraica Veritas, the Greek Veritas, and the Latina Veritas. So a lot of very interesting problems, but in the study of Second Temple period, what should we do?
Looks like we have some hands for people who would like to respond. We'll go in order: Kristin, John, and then Gerburn. And then I suspect we will have to stop there for our break. Kristin?
Okay. So maybe that's actually, I mean, your kind of questioning is actually very important. So, okay. So I think we should set up, and maybe you should set up in the Enoch seminar, a series of collaborative thematic things where we take a theme and then follow it through. It's one of the things that I recommend for doctoral theses, right? If you want to work on a topic, say, you know, what does it mean to be a child, or, you know, child or son or whatsoever? Take it to the Hebrew Bible, take it to the Septuagint, take it to Qumran, take it to all the other material, the Second Temple literature, broader material, and even go into the little book which we call the New Testament. So we can actually completely, and I think that's the way I do it. I try to trace the history of the things. I mean, who of us, you know, regularly takes the big concordance of the Pseudepigrapha out of its cupboard and works with it? There is not enough people who just go through the whole thing. So maybe we should set up series and conferences that focus, you know, systematically and take major topic, you know, covenant. What is covenant? And boom, take it through. What does it mean to be in a community, and take it through? Maybe we should set it up for the next coming 10, 15 years. I mean, I would love to help on that kind of stuff. No, I do not want to help because I actually have already too much. But I mean, the idea is that it's that kind of thing should be happening.
So in a sense, to keep in mind that there are Apocrypha, but not talking directly of the Apocrypha, if I understand correctly, I mean, talking more directly on Second Temple Jewish literature.
Yes,
okay.
Take it on, but always include it. Deliberately make sure that in no article, in no conference, it can be taken out of context. So it's like, we have produced a couple of volumes like the reception history of Torah, but that means that you have to first know what is going on in the Hebrew Bible, in the Septuagint and all the rest, and then you take it further. So if we were to set up, it's the same thing like about 10 years ago, I had a discussion with the organizers of the Deuteronomistic sessions in Heidelberg. And I said, you cannot deal with Deuteronomistic theology if you don't do text criticism, because that gives you another set of texts. And I think it's thematically the same thing. We can no longer set up a conference if we do not take every bit of literature that there is into consideration. And if I can just add a little bit more, we have to add ancient Near East, classical studies, and to do it a full scope. So instead of focusing on only our little fields, we have to just open it up and make it a systematic point. You know, you could do it in your Enoch seminar. Let's go for the next 10 years and set up a thematic, every year, at least one thematic conference on one specific topic.
Yes, and I agree also with Sara, with the comment that Sara just made. John, probably.
I have to do more thinking about. I really like the question that Josh highlighted from Lorenzo. It's really important, and the question has puzzled me also, particularly as I tried to think of what's the central coherence of this volume. I guess I naively have always considered the lack of apocalyptic in the Apocrypha to be part of the trend within the canon. And so have not thought about this independently of that. I think that this particular question does need to be evaluated within the broader question of canonical development, and actually why are there not more explicitly apocalyptic works in the canon as a whole? Strikes me as being part of this discussion. That's an initial question that I have, while recognizing that the feeling that there is something at the center of this collection that I can't get my hands on.
Yeah.
Yes, so in response to Gabriel's question and adding to what has already been said, I don't think we should study the Apocrypha as a separate selection, but really integrated in early Jewish studies. And I was also very impressed by the conference several months ago, Second Temple Judaism, a Global Perspective, how many new and young scholars there are. Yes, and I think a thematic approach, indeed, a number of conferences between now and, let's say, 10 years, and adding to that, so to say, also newer approaches, newer methodologies will really enrich the whole field, yeah, if you then also include the Apocrypha to it. So I'm very much looking forward to that and to be part of it, if possible. Thank you.
But if I may, I think in any case, we should monitor also in our thematic discussions, in order to be sure that none of the many documents of the New Testament are neglected. Because, yes. Of course, you are perfectly right, Gerd. I mean, there is a tendency in all times, in all epochs, to single out some text from the Second Temple period that is more important than other. I mean, right. In the past, other texts were studied with more insistence. Now other texts have become more important, and I think we should always be careful that to be inclusive. I mean, that none of the many pieces of Jewish literature of the time is neglected.
Right. But I think if you have a thematic conference, you avoid that problem. For example, the theme Jewish practices and beliefs, you have to look at all the sources. Of course, some sources will be less talkative about it and others maybe more, but a next theme, women and gender or text criticism, etc. Every thematic approach makes sure that every text is going to be looked at. You can't avoid it. So I think a thematic approach really would be great. And the thematic chapters in the handbook are not all the possibilities, because I had a number of authors work whom I asked to do other topics, but not everyone was available or willing. So there are more themes possible. So
this is a really great conversation. Yeah. We're reaching our point at 12:30, and I want to respect everyone's need for a break. We're going to take 30 minutes and reconvene at 1 p.m. Eastern time. I have a question though, and I'm going to throw it out now and I'll reintroduce it later, but I'll be quick. There were so many wonderful terms used in the book to talk about what is the Apocrypha. Is it rewritten text? Is it Bible? Gabriella, you talked about the text in reference to Old Testament Apocrypha. None of the other presenters had used that designation, Old Testament Apocrypha, until you had arrived. And that hit my ears a little differently. I want to come back to this after the break, but there's a question about what terms should be used and should not be used, I think, moving forward. That may be a valuable conversation, but let's pause there. We'll take a 30-minute break. As a reminder, the Zoom session will remain open, so people are welcome to just stay on, and we will see you again in 30 minutes, okay? Thank you, everyone. Yes, yep, it's 1 o'clock, so we'll officially begin our second session now. This session, again, as a reminder, we'll have 2 presentations and followed by some open dialogue. We'll welcome Esther Brownsmith, followed by Brandon Hawk, to give presentations, critical reviews of this work, and then we will return to more open discussion. As a reminder, I invite everyone to speak slowly enough for the automated transcription to pick up your language, so all of our participants can engage in the presentations. So are there any questions, last minute questions from the panelists? If not, we will begin with our next presentation. Seeing none, then we'll turn it over to Esther. The floor is yours.
Fantastic. Let me open up my shared screen. Hopefully you can see it now. So, greetings and a very warm thank you to the organizers, especially Joshua, for inviting me to offer my thoughts on this very important volume. I am not primarily a scholar of the Apocrypha, but I am a scholar of gender in the ancient world. And so I was very pleased when I read the second sentence of the book's introduction. This handbook gives special attention to the place of the Apocrypha in the context of early Judaism, the relationship between the Apocrypha and texts that came to be canonized, the role of women and female characters, the portrayal of gender and sexuality, the interplay between theology, ethics, and halakha, and the relationships between the Apocrypha and the Septuagint, as well as their reception history in the Western world. Now, the presence of gender in not one, but 2 of the book's stated priorities demonstrates from the start that gender is not an afterthought or a tangent for the book's editors, but rather a central lens for understanding these texts. And a few pages later, Agama's overview of the book's contents affirms, while several key apocryphal texts can be studied for their female protagonists, as masculinity is also under construction in the texts, the question of gender is applicable to every ancient text and artifact. Beyond the analysis of female protagonists and the quest for women's history, gender is a lens through which all historical and literary analysis should be approached. And I really couldn't agree more. I quote these 2 paragraphs at length because for me, they set the bar for the rest of the book, and it is a high bar indeed. So with the rest of my time here, I will focus on an exploration of the ways that the Oxford Handbook of the Apocrypha rises to this bar, as well as some of the ways where I saw potential for even further achievement. The handbook is a far-reaching accomplishment worth celebrating, and one of its strengths is the extent to which it is forward-looking, even as it addresses all the traditional expectations for such a volume. So for that reason, I was reminded as I prepared this of the unattributed quote that's been floating around the internet for a few years. The inventor of the engine used a horse every day of his life. The inventor of the light bulb worked by candlelight. The inventor of steel had a house full of iron. Participating in the world as it is does not disqualify you from trying to improve it. So I hope that my comments will be taken not as a critique of what is an excellent volume, but as an invitation to take its promise even further. Now, any conversation about gender in the Apocrypha, both in the discussion of this book and I suspect in future discussions in the field more broadly, is going to have to begin with Sara Parks's excellent chapter on women and gender in the Apocrypha. The chapter makes all of the necessary moves. It reflects on what we can and cannot know about women in ancient Judaism. It reviews the history of the field, and it discusses some of the key female characters within the Apocrypha. But it also offers a remarkable challenge to the field as a whole. Parks notes that while there are bounteous studies on gender in the Apocrypha, along with other ancient textual corpuses, they inevitably find themselves relegated to a single chapter in a book where they can be skipped over by anyone not interested in gender, as if gender is something one can remain unaffected by. Now, it was impossible for me to read this sentence without first nodding in acknowledgement of its incisive accuracy, and second, pausing and stepping back to look at its slightly ironic context. Wasn't the statement itself relegated to a single chapter in a book? But Parks is firm in her argument, and she returns to it in the chapter's conclusion. The next stage in this and other disciplines will occur when the lens of gender is no longer compartmentalized as a single chapter in a volume. Now, of course, this statement would only be truly ironic if Parks's chapter were the only place where gender is discussed in the volume, and it is not. In addition to William Loder's examination of sexuality in the Apocrypha, which intersects at many points with gender norms, the role of women in gender is discussed throughout the second and largest part of the volume, which goes through the texts individually. So it is therefore to those discussions that I now turn in order to see whether Parks's vision has been realized. The 16 texts that comprise the Apocrypha in this volume received a wide variety of treatments, each focusing on a different set of issues and questions within its text. Now, the benefit of this variety, rather than the formulaic structure found in some anthologies, is that it gave its authors the space for in-depth exploration of those issues that the author found of particular relevance, from textual histories to ethical themes. But the author's liberty meant that each one could choose how much to integrate gender into their discussion. So I surveyed each of the 16 chapters for discussions of gender, and while I was liberal about what qualified, I left out chapters that merely included female characters in the course of their overview of the text. This is what I found. Of the 16 chapters, only 5 of them dealt with gender in any significant way, less than a third of them. In 3 of the cases, the discussion of gender took place in a distinct section whose title mentioned women. In 2 other cases, the discussion appeared as an overtly feminist analysis of the text themes. Now, 2 more observations are worth mentioning. First of all, these discussions of gender were entirely about women. Masculinity was not mentioned, and manliness only appeared in a note about 4th Maccabees, where it attributes it to the mother of the 7 sons. And second, of the 5 chapters, 3 were written by women, whereas women comprised less than a third of the authors as a whole. So I'll return to both of these observations. Perhaps the best example of integrating gender into a broader analysis came in Karina Martin Hogan's chapter on Baruch. Hogan's approach appears first in her overview of theological themes, where she discusses the implications of personifying both wisdom and Zion as women. Among other incisive observations, she notes that Baruch's poem of consolation can be seen as an inversion of the typical misogynistic prophetic marriage metaphor, in that it evokes sympathy for the female partner. Hogan continues this lens in her next section on ethical themes, where she states up front that her approach will be feminist, in that questions relating to gender and power will be foregrounded. And in the discussion that follows, she deals with several aspects of Baruch's ethical systems, from a stance that is conscious not only of gendered concerns, but also of modern implications of the text for settler colonialism and the criminal justice system. Hogan's analysis never stretches the text to become a mere pretext to expound on her own ethical priorities. Rather, those priorities shape her awareness of the text's nuances as well as its modern relevance. Her conclusions neither reject Baruch as a product of patriarchy, nor uplift it as a feminist manifesto. Instead, they acknowledge it as a multifaceted document that can be used both to oppress and to liberate and inspire. There is no section titled Women in Hogan's chapter, yet feminist concerns permeate and shape it in multiple ways. And so in this way, I think it beautifully embodies Parks's vision of Apocrypha scholarship that will, quote, integrate the study of women and gender, not in a compartmentalized way, but rather in such a way as to deconstruct and span disciplinary categories. So in the time that remains, I want to invite you into an exercise in imagination, where I offer some possibilities for how gender could be further integrated into discussions where it was perhaps absent or perhaps present in a segregated unit. I do so in a spirit of deep humility as someone who is not an expert in these specific texts, and those who are may well have critiques about my specific ideas. But my goal is not to argue for any one of these ideas, but rather to invite awareness of how the construction of gender norms can affect virtually every text. So what would it look like to integrate gender consciousness more broadly in our scholarship? Well, it starts by recognizing that gender is something that men do, not just women. Masculinity studies in the Bible have been a growing field for the past couple of decades, but at least in my initial searches, I found very little about masculinity in Apocrypha scholarship, whether in this volume or beyond. Yet there are countless ways that masculinity interacts with these texts. In the martyrdom stories of 4th Maccabees, the tortured and graphically penetrable bodies of Eleazar and the 7 sons create a model of honorable masculinity where youth and strength play no part. I am reminded of Rhiannon Graybill's work on the biblical prophets and their uneasy relationship with masculinity. So how does this distorted masculinity influence the ways that these martyrs become idealized and even immortal figures? Or in the story of Susanna within the additions to Daniel, there is much to be said about Susanna's gender, but what about the gender of the other characters? Susanna's husband is essentially absent from the story. Either he's unable to defend her, or he believes that his own honor is best served by putting her on trial. The 2 lustful elders are a masculine contrast with the boy Daniel, whose youth and virtue are in opposition with their age and vice. And in fact, Daniel's wise impartiality seems to stem from the fact that he isn't yet fully a man, a moral underlined by the story's conclusion that for this reason, youths are beloved by Jacob because of their simplicity. So should we conclude, therefore, that adult masculinity is untrustworthy? Moving elsewhere, I even argue that gender studies could influence examinations like the chapter on the additions to Esther, which focuses almost exclusively on the additions' textual history. Even here, I would submit that gender plays a role. Mordecai's dream portrays Esther as a river, which connects to the biblical metaphor of woman as a spring that underlies both overt metaphors in Proverbs and the woman at the well type scenes in Genesis. And moreover, the scene where Esther removes her finery, putting on mourning clothes and ashes and prays to God, is highly reminiscent of the scene in Joseph and Asenath where Asenath does the same. This detailed glimpse into Esther's actions and the prayer that follows from her lips indicate a much greater interest in women's piety than the editions that focused on royal decrees, where they mention Esther exactly once as the innocent companion of our kingdom. So could these gendered attitudes provide a clue as to the complex history of the editions? Perhaps. So I'll stop my share there. Now, on the one hand, these observations may sound a little bit unfair. The limitations of space meant that every chapter had to winnow down its discussion to the most important issues. And indeed, there are many other topics like slavery and disability that received less attention than gender. Moreover, I found that the chapters that made little mention of gender were still incisive, thoughtful, and excellently written. But I also think that it's no coincidence that 3 of the 5 chapters that discuss gender were written by women who have had to spend their lives in a world that revolved around a gender not their own. This outsider perspective can highlight how fragile and artificial the norms of gender are, and yet how deeply they permeate every aspect of existence. And I must add that the same is true of other outsider perspectives, whether stemming from race, sexuality, nationality, disability, or other forms of difference. Diversity in authorship leads naturally to richer and broader scholarship, and gender is only one aspect of this. So to conclude, I am very grateful for the opportunity to read this richly detailed, ambitious, and expansive volume. It clearly moves Second Temple scholarship forward in both established trajectories and new directions. As a scholar of gender in ancient Judaism, I'm excited both by its important observations about the role of women within the Apocrypha and by the challenge that it issues for further exploration of how sensitivity to all genders can enrich all our scholarly observations. At the beginning of my response, I mentioned the adage that the inventor of the light bulb worked by candlelight. The light cast by this volume is bright indeed, and I hope it will illuminate the path for many future developments in the field of Apocrypha. So congratulations to everyone involved in creating it, and thank you so much for your time.
Excellent. Thank you so much. We now turn to Brandon Huck. Brandon, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Joshua. And thank you for inviting me to this review and organizing the two panels for this book. I also want to thank everybody signed on today, Gerber and Ugama for editing the volume, the contributors for their chapters, and other panelists for their thoughts so far today. We already have a lot to think about. At the outset, I want to echo what others have already said. The Oxford Handbook of the Apocrypha is an excellent volume, and I've enjoyed reading through it and thinking with it quite a lot. I'm glad to see a diverse group of contributors in the volume and a wide range of different types of contributions in the book, ranging across a bunch of different methodological and theoretical ways of thinking about the Apocrypha. I have no doubt that this volume will become a standard reference for those interested in the subject for years to come. As Lorenzo has already said, it's really going to stand out among the other volumes like it. And it presents chapters relevant for scholars who are already versed in the corpus of the deuterocanonical works and those just beginning their forays into these works. So like Esther said at the end of her talk, congratulations on everyone involved. In my comments today, I want to use this volume to situate the Apocrypha and Apocrypha studies generally in terms of globality, to think about the deuterocanonical works across diverse communities in the histories of Judaism and Christianity. In other words, I'm interested in the transmission and reception of the Apocrypha. Not surprising, since I'm primarily a medievalist and not somebody who studies Second Temple or early Christianity. To start, I'm particularly interested in some of the explicit references to the global context of Judaism and Christianity in scholarship on the Apocrypha. A few of these stood out to me most prominently in the volume. For example, Gerber emphasizes that apocalypticism in the Apocrypha, quote, must be understood in a much more global context of an ancient apocalyptic mindset that influenced much of early Judaism and early Christianity. Lorenzo suggests in a note that scholars need to foster an appreciation of apocalyptic in its global historical sense. And Sara Parks emphasizes the benefits to scholarship as now the voices of racialized and global scholars are finally beginning to be included in feminist studies of the Apocrypha, and later, as a new generation brings to the discussion more explicit theoretical frameworks, as well as more global and intersectional perspectives to the study of women and gender. In addition to these explicit references, the volume contains much that is rich for considering the Apocrypha in their global contexts. A recurring theme, of course, is Jewish diaspora from the Second Temple period onward. And another is the notion of diversity of the authors, texts, and contexts of the Apocrypha. Some contributions gesture toward the global nature of Christianity and related issues involved with the historical study of the Apocrypha, with discussions of Armenian, Coptic, Hebrew, Slavonic, and Syriac versions. For example, Lee Martin McDonald spends a little time offering some thoughts about different versions, and Mika S. Paginin considers the centrality of the Hebrew and Syriac witnesses for examining Psalms 151 to 155. These offer gestures toward the multilingual and cross-cultural afterlives of the deuterocanonical works that are worth further significant consideration. In the rest of my comments, I want to dwell on a single question. What might be gained from broadening our scope to situate the Apocrypha within the global? I'm inspired by recent shifts in scholarship, and as Gabriele said earlier, like the methodological turn toward concepts like global late antiquity and the global Middle Ages. Since I was invited to this panel as a reviewer, I can echo praises of the volume that others have expressed, but I also have some critiques. And I want to present my thoughts as starting points for future work and ways to reconsider the Apocrypha, not specifically as negative assessments of this volume, the editor, or any individual contributors. Here I want to emphasize what John Kampen said earlier in the panel, the earlier panel today, about how we limit our scope and understandings as epistemological boundaries for scholarship on the Apocrypha, and what we gain from expanding those boundaries. With that in mind, I want to pose my criticisms as hopeful for the field of Apocrypha studies. Despite the few explicit references to globality that I've already highlighted, the global nature of the Apocrypha is not especially centered in this volume. There's no single chapter related to the topic, nor do Ugama or the contributors make claims to that aim, nor is it a common topic in Apocrypha studies more generally. Much of the volume tends to highlight the divide between Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox Christians on the one hand, who accept the Apocrypha, and Protestant Christians on the other, who don't. There are some brief references to other views of the canon, but the majority of the contributions tend to focus on Roman Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, and Protestant conceptions of the canon, as well as Greek and Latin versions of the Apocrypha. This isn't surprising for a few reasons. One is that the Apocrypha, both as a collection and the individual works, are most well-known and best preserved in Greek versions as they circulated in the Great Septuagint Pandects that were compiled by early Christians. Kristin DeTroyer lays this out well in her chapter on the Greek textual witnesses. But another reason for so much framing around Protestant views versus Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox views is that the history of scholarship on the Bible and Apocrypha has been largely influenced by underlying polemical battles between Roman Catholic and Protestant scholars. Nonetheless, we might gain a lot from considering the Apocrypha with a shift in focus toward outward to other Jewish and Christian communities across geographies, cultures, and periods. None of the contributors to the Oxford Handbook mention Ethiopian Jews who identify with the title Beta Israel, and little is said about Oriental Orthodox or Church of the East Christianity, such as the Orthodox Tewahedo and Assyrian Christians. In particular, Beta Israel Jews pose a fascinating case because, like the Orthodox Tewahedo Christians, they do consider the deuterocanonical works to be canonical, along with several other writings considered to be apocryphal to other Jews and Christians, like Jubilees, 1st Enoch, and 4th Baruch. In fact, such a robust biblical canon recently prompted the editors of the Jewish Annotated Apocrypha to include Jubilees in their volume. In that collection, Annette Yoshiko Reed reminds us of, quote, the local diversity of longstanding lived traditions of liturgy, teaching, and textuality. And Eva Mracek discusses how the rhetoric of a fixed canon is a construction in the histories of Judaism and Christianity. Ge'ez versions of deuterocanonical and apocryphal works from medieval Ethiopia have recently gained increased attention from scholars, and more is warranted, since both Beta Israel and Orthodox Tewahedo communities provide important contributions to the histories of Judaism and Christianity beyond the usual suspects of European traditions. According to demographic data from 2021, there are around 172,000 Beta Israel Jews around the world, most prominently in Israel and Ethiopia, but also in the USA and in diaspora elsewhere. To take Beta Israel Judaism as just one example, by looking beyond familiar religious communities, we might gain a much more nuanced and complex idea about how diverse even Judaism is in its approach to concepts of canon, scriptures, and how the Apocrypha remain part of Jewish and Christian lived religious experiences today. A few relevant research questions remain to be explored. How do Beta Israel Jews incorporate the Apocrypha into their beliefs and practices now? Are there other Jews who engage with the Apocrypha today in their own lived religious experiences? In fact, the idea of lived religious experiences opens up other possibilities for considering the role of the Apocrypha in Jewish and Christian communities around the world from their inception to the present. Surely, there are many Jews and Christians who continue to practice their faiths with the help of Apocrypha even today. After all, the Apocrypha are considered to be part of the canonical Bible for the majority of Christians around the world. Of the estimated 2.3 billion Christians worldwide, only about 35 to 40% are Protestant, while Roman Catholics make up about 50% and Orthodox Christians make up about 12%. Even some Protestants, like Anglicans, which make up about 3.7% of Christians worldwide, continue to use the Apocrypha at least for reading and edification, if not for doctrine. And as Matthew J. Corkman demonstrates in his chapter, many Protestants were historically pro-Apocrypha even up to the 19th century. In the same vein of thinking about lived religion up to the present, there are a few other avenues left to explore with the role of Apocrypha. Some questions emerge, such as, what was the influence of the Apocrypha, for example, on liturgy, literature, and art in the Middle Ages, not only in Latin and Greek Christianity, but also more globally, such as in Ethiopian Judaism and Christianity. Considering the expansion of Christianity with modern imperialism, how did the Apocrypha play a role in colonialism across the world in the early modern period? Closer to our own time, how do Jews and Christians worldwide incorporate the Apocrypha into religious beliefs and practices, such as collective worship or private devotion? What do the Apocrypha have to do with Christians from the global South, such as in liberation theology? I'm reminded again of the voices of racialized and global scholars that Parks mentions in her chapter. Finally, even more broadly, how do the Apocrypha play a role in global cultures more generally, such as in literature, art, and other media in the 21st century? These are just a few of the questions that I began to wonder about as I thought through the possibilities for the future of the study of the Apocrypha. Once again, I return to hope for future scholarship, for the type of generative studies that are made even more possible because of volumes like the Oxford Handbook of the Apocrypha. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you very much for your contributions, Esther and Brandon. Gabrielle, I'll turn it over to you to chair this part of the discussion.
Thank you to our panelists, for their contribution. I think these are very interesting questions, and they open also some new perspectives about the study of the Apocrypha, just continuing the discussion we had in the previous session. Maybe we should start with some reactions from people that have contributed or edited the volume, just to have a sort of response to the response, so that we can start a discussion. I think that already we have touched some important issues. For instance, the necessity, the need to explore more carefully the reception history of the Apocrypha, which is something that has not been really yet done. Not only for the Apocrypha, also for the pseudepigrapha. There is a lot of work now on this issue, and it's something that should certainly be explored with more attention. And also how this work on reception history influenced the study of the Apocrypha in their original Second Temple Jewish context. The first, Esther was stressing the point of gender, making a very important point. I think that the point is not so much to stress the importance of gender, but to see as to integrate gender studies in our normal, ordinary conversation. Which is true also for other, of course, you mentioned disability, you mentioned ethnicity. We can mention other elements that have been more traditionally explored, like politics, ideological interest, conflicts among groups. But it's very interesting that we struggle. We really try very, very hard to integrate all these elements in our ordinary reading of the text. Without even having the need of adding a chapter. This could be the norm, should become the norm. But anyway, I think that already we have a lot of things to discuss, and I would like to turn to the editors, to the editor and the authors of the book for some preliminary reactions to what we have heard from our panelists. Kristin.
Thank you. Thank you so much for Esther for saying that. You're right. You're actually completely right. I've done articles on feminist, not gender, but feminist readings on Esther, but I didn't incorporate it. And you're right. Actually, I should have done that. Similarly, when talking about the other versions, I could have made the link to the global context. Mea culpa, mea maxima culpa. Yes. We have to learn the same way as we have to learn to incorporate Apocrypha in our daily work with Jewish history and Jewish literature. We have to incorporate, we have to make a decision to at least be aware of these important issues. So thank you very much.
Ken, you have to unmute. Ken, you have to unmute your
Yes.
mic.
I also want to say a big thank you to Esther and Brandon for their reviews, which set the bar very high, but I think in a very fair way, and mention a number of points that really are, yeah, from my point of view, deficiencies of the book are things that can be improved. And point to forward to future research, just as a kind of excuse, although it's not a real excuse. Of course, as an editor, one is with one foot in past scholarship and when another foot in future scholarship, and in between, you have to manage authors that have all kind of reasons not to submit in time, and a publisher who says, where are we now? Of course, it's a longer process. So between today and when I started is 5 years. At the same time, one teaches and one sees shifts going on in student population in terms of their interest for early Judaism and the Apocrypha, and which is an extremely interesting thing. So the handbook, though being a handbook, is of course in the end also just a snapshot of present research and wants to contribute to further discussion. So in that sense, I'm very grateful for both of your reviews. And I think the two topics you mentioned should be added to the ones we discussed this morning as things we should give more attention to. So thank you.
Yes, John, let's have in a free discussion. Also, I would like to say for people that are not appearing on the screen, I mean, if you want to join our panel and express your view or simply want to show your face, you are more than welcome. Because the meeting has been organized as a seminar, so as an opportunity of a free exchange. So we don't have to be a formal line of communication. So feel even free to interrupt each other, as we'll do if we were sitting around the table. Okay, John.
Thank you, Esther, for that very incisive evaluation. And many of us have a good deal of work to do in that area to make our works more comprehensive with regard to gender concerns and other related concerns. My comments are primarily on the global question. And of course, this broader reception history is important. A few years ago, I realized here where I live in Cincinnati that there were actually local members of Beta Israel that lived in the community. They're actually professionals. And so I was curious because I was working on the Temple Scroll with Bensi and Wacholder at the time. So we interviewed some of them to determine whether there were any practices represented in the Temple Scroll and that related Qumran corpus that appeared in the present practices of Beta Israel. It was a fascinating process, which regrettably didn't really enough results to get any publication out of it. But the learning process was interesting and illustrative of possibilities that should be examined on a regular basis. What I'm curious about with regard to this broader reception history is whether that also brings us back to look at our Second Temple period differently. We tend to kind of put it into a pretty limited perspective, and I don't think fully utilize the breadth of Jewish existence that was actually there in the Roman period. When I'm teaching this, I talk about the Roman Empire as one of the great examples of globalization present to prior to what we're experiencing in the modern world, and to take what we can learn from present reception history and follow those trends through, but also then to take what we learn back to more fully appreciate the global context in which the texts we're discussing originated. And to think more carefully, we tend to pretty well reduce those to two entities, diaspora and Judean, and put every composition somewhere within those two categories, and assume that we know everything about their geographical and social location. And I'm wondering whether we actually can't use this as an opportunity to expand our understanding of the globalized context in which the texts originated also.
Thanks. Brandon.
I think that's a great way forward. As you were talking, I was thinking about my own work as a medievalist, and the divide of Christianity that we see in the medieval period, showing us how much diversity, but even in one locality, seeing quite a diversity in beliefs and practices that comes out in the literature that they were writing or the art that they were creating or things like that. I was reminded of what you said reminded me of Walter Bauer's work on early Christianity, which still, gets quite a lot of pushback from certain sectors. But the idea that Christianity, for the first 300-400 years, wasn't a single monolithic thing and wasn't cohesive. And we can push that forward all the way up to the present. Of course it's not. It's why we have so many different sects and denominations and practices and beliefs across the globe and across cultures. And I think it's helpful to think about that in Second Temple. And we already it's the way we already sort of talk about Second Temple Judaism, even though it might not be explicitly made apparent in the scholarship. We talk about Qumran, for example. It's clear that the people living around Qumran believe very differently than Jews living in diaspora in Alexandria, for example, or those living in Jerusalem around the temple area, So we already talk about these communities as if they're diverse, but focusing on that diversity as a way into the material might be really useful and a way forward. And thinking about what that means globally, I think, is an interesting one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, what you just said, Hop, was very important. The aspect of the lived religion, and that's something that we have to also learn to include in our scholarship, because when we deal with texts, very often these texts reflect lived religion. And of course, the lived religion is something that hasn't stopped somewhere. It has continued. So for me, the category of lived religion could be a category that ties together all these different corpora into modern times. Lived religion.
I see a very strong interest here in reception history, and I understand that not much work has been done on the. I wonder only. I mean, I'll ask it also to you, Lorenzo, because we recently did all this work on the reception history of the pseudepigrapha, and I wonder to which extent the reception history of the Apocrypha could be separated from the history research of the pseudepigrapha. Does it really make sense? Or considering also the implications, the fact that already in Second Temple Judaism, we have different groups having different canons, okay? Reception history starts already in the Second Temple period, so it becomes part of a larger issue of how people were dealing with authoritative text and a different perception of what we now call a canon. I don't know. I'm a little bit undecided because on one end, I would like very much a book on the reception history of the Apocrypha because it's something that's missing, something we didn't do. I mean, on the other hand, I understand that this is difficult to separate. I mean, from a broader context. How can you make a clear-cut distinction between Apocrypha and pseudepigrapha, which in some of the churches doesn't make any sense. I mean, and at the same time, how can really separate it from the process that started already in the Second Temple period, in which we already had different groups that consider different texts in different ways.
I think the reception and rewriting are two sides of the same coin, and we have to start accepting that every text is in a response or a rewriting and an updating of a previous or of a report of a previous experience, and so you constantly update, and so the reception starts as soon as you start rewriting a text. And for me, that of course is important because it's where your textual history, your complete diversity of versions, Greek, Coptic, etc., starts. So in that sense, you have to accept from the very beginning that there is not an authoritative, stable text, which is for once and for eternity there. We have to start thinking in rewriting and reception history, and we tried to do this a little bit, but we were. In Salzburg, we have the Society for the Study of Deuterocanonical Literature. And we have, for the past years, I'm just going to share it. We have started on the early reception of, and we've started to do that. But I realize it need to be broader. We need to set something up where we incorporate, Hebrew Bible, Qumran, Septuagint, intertestamental literature, New Testament, etc., and do that systematically. So, reception history is tied to rewriting. I do not know what is a final text because I can't. There's not such a thing as a final text. Certainly not when you're in text criticism. It doesn't exist. So what is it, and how can you show that it's constantly rewritten and received and rewritten?
Lorenzo.
Yes, so I would like to point at something else that I think connects early reception history, later reception history, lived religion, present-day interest in it, and that is simply the question or the observation. There is obviously something in the Apocrypha that interests us, that captivates us, that inspires us for already 2,000 years. So there is something in it that is almost like biblical books. It's not officially canonical, but it has a similar function that it captivates everyone in every age and in every culture, and we have not yet, so to say, and it is confirmed by my students, 20-year-olds who have never read anything about it who are equally interested and captivated by it. Yeah, and so there is something in it, and we have not yet come to catch that what is in it. You know, we only know what is it, maybe not. It's not apocalyptic, but what is in the Apocrypha that captivates us so much?
Lorenzo, you wanted to say.
Actually, I wanted to respond to your question, and I see that in the comments, Brandon has started a response, the first of two responses I'd like to make. On the one hand, Brandon writes, we can't really separate the reception of the Apocrypha from the reception of the Bible. For the first 1500 years, they were tied together completely across Christianity. He's absolutely right on that. It's actually more complex than that, and as Brandon well knows. One need only look at manuscript copies of what Bibles were in either the Greek-speaking world or the Latin-speaking world to realize that frequently they were bound up or contained other versions of texts that we would call apocryphal, small a apocryphal. And then on lower and lower levels, we see how distinctions, these are heuristic distinctions on, to go to your question, Gabrielle, you know, can we study the Apocrypha separate from the pseudepigrapha? It's not really a meaningful distinction, you know, about 1200 years later in, say, France or something like that, or what would become France. Well, it's not always a meaningful distinction. Certainly distinctions can be made from between Bible and other sorts of material, depending on the context, especially along the theologians, but in many of the other texts, so the old, what used to be called the vulgar literature, those distinctions are often irrelevant, to which may be added, to sort of conclude this first point, the incredible mass of material that we often forget that was composed after the 3rd, 4th, and 5th centuries, and all were added to this this storehouse of ideas from which all these sorts of authors drew. That's my first point. The second point is more disciplinary. I mean, it's nice to talk. There's no reason why we shouldn't, and I think Kristin, I'm glad to see her highlight her series there because it's a great first start. But we do have to remember that Second Temple specialists, for instance, who wish to trace a book or theme, an apocryphal book or theme, or pseudepigraphal book or theme, whatever, 12, 13, 1400 years in the future, are dealing with a context that's literally 12 or 1400 years in the future, and in entirely different social contexts, and often in languages with which they're unfamiliar. So we have a situation where specialists in early Christianity, early Judaism, have a certain familiarity with late antiquity, and that familiarity with general context diminishes rapidly once you move out of late antiquity into the early medieval or early Byzantine periods, and so on and so forth down the line. You have specialists in early Christianity, late antiquity, who sort of stand in between the early medieval period or the Byzantine periods and Syriac periods, and before that, the early Judaism and Christianity. But the history of scholarship has firewalled apocrypha and pseudepigrapha from early Christian apocryphal texts, and as we well know, the history of scholarship on pseudepigrapha and early Christian apocrypha, essentially OT pseudepigrapha and New Testament apocrypha, to use those old terms, but they're still valuable in this particular context, have followed along similar lines, have asked the similar questions, have come up with similar answers, but they're conducted almost independently. Moving a little bit forward, even still, and Brandon knows this, of course. I mean, he's an Anglo-Saxon early English specialist, and who's producing a revised version of Sources in Anglo-Saxon Literary Culture, which I believe has a new name now. And he knows this very well, that there are superb scholars who have done a tremendous amount of work since literally the 1880s on Western vernacular reception of these sorts of texts. And they're dealing with the end result of 1,000 years of transmission, transmutation, rewriting, recycling, and re-editing in generally Western vernacular cultures. One example comes to mind just off the top of my head. Of course, Brian Murdoch's work with traditions like Adam and Eve in the medieval Germanic traditions. So there are pretty large disciplinary gulfs between them. So I think once we realize that, and I think they are realized, the next question is, how do we get around them? And I think a catch-all rarely works because people come into the discussion with their own ideas. And I think a more structured conference or series of volumes would work. Again, Hebron's volume on the Apocrypha is a good example of that. Just two, I guess, background comments in a way to sort of contextualize your question, Gabriel.
Mm-hmm. No, in this sense, I think that sometimes also will be interesting also to do something. Going back to a question I made in the first session. I mean, what this distinguished group of specialists in Old Testament Apocrypha can suggest about the way to promote the study of this material. And I think it's important to have meetings in which we have some thematic meetings. I mean, in which we integrate the study of the Apocrypha. And I wonder also if it would be important also to do something on each single volume, addressing this text from all possible perspectives. Okay. Because I don't know, recently I attended a conference on Tobit, in perception of Tobit in Islamic sources. It was very interesting. I mean, it was something that usually we not deal with. Okay, and having a conference on a volume like Tobit, I mean, dealing with all aspects of this text from all different perspectives, okay, including the reception history of the volume, sometimes could be really very, very interesting. Also, yeah, to go back to each of the single text and to take them as a case in study. I mean, for seeing all the different, integrating all the different methodology, all the different approaches, and all the aspects also of the manuscript reception, of the reimagination of this text and these stories, also in literature and the arts. And I think this is something that is so much broader in comparison what we used to do even a few years ago. I don't want to say a few years ago, a few decades ago. So I think we should also think of this possibility.
I think it's a good idea. I think it's important to realize what I think it's a great idea to focus on a single book, because the book contains the images, the book contains the themes, the book contains the stories, the book contains the ideas, and it's also the point at which later communities and authors approached the book, not necessarily through the thematic issues with which we as scholars are always concerned, but rather the things in the book themselves. But it's important to highlight what level at which a conference should take place. And the Enoch Seminar seems to be ideal for this. I mean, on the one hand, it can't be introductory. It can't be that we're all there to find out all about the Book of Tobit, and to use your example, and to figure out, hey, this is what's happening in Islam, or this is what's happening in Westphalia in the 1400s, or whatever that may be. On the other hand, it can't be simply, and this is the other end of the spectrum, it could not be simply a collection of scholars who present well-defined research papers that outline the topic as if that's the end result. That's the end of things to say on it, and we all get around and sort of nod sagely. I'm being a bit facetious here, but what it should be is reflective of the scholarship as it exists today. As you rightly point out, Tobit has got a history of scholarship in Islam. It's got a history of scholarship in Western art. I can't speak of Eastern art, I'm not familiar with that. And so on down the line, multiplied, say, by 24. And so what would be ideal would be for specialist scholars to come in and to present the broad outlines of Tobit, however conceived, in their particular areas or cultural contexts, and have the idea of the conference that its participants would draw from these presentations and contextualize their own research. So the volume that the product that comes out is truly an integrated product, and not just a series of, Tobit in early Judaism, Tobit in Christian, which is fine. I mean, it's got to be structured somehow, but there's got to be an internal cohesion that transcends the limitations of each article that makes the volume worthwhile in the way that I think you have in mind.
Timothy. We have problem with the audio. We have problems with you. We cannot. We only have some noise, but not your voice. It could not be your voice. No.
It sounds like there's a filter on your voice.
Yes, there is a filter on your voice, something like that. Maybe you should reconnect, try to reconnect again.
Yeah. It sounds like you're transmitting from the star Vega or something.
Yeah. Was it like a sci-fi?
Yeah. A message from Alpha Centauri.
Yeah.
I think his children, played with it.
No, I mean, going back to the point of Lorenzo of having a single volume. I mean, we haven't done it also at the Enoch seminar for a while. But for me, it would be fascinating to see how all the progress that we have done, all the developments that we've done about the diversity of approaches, integration of reception history, could be integrated in one conference. I mean, I perfectly agree with you. I mean, not as a series of unrelated studies, but as an opportunity to see the relationship, the integration of different approaches and different points of view in the study of the same texts. I think this would be probably very interesting. I think it will be very different from what we have done only a few decades ago. Timothy, do you want to try again?
Sure.
Okay.
How's that?
Now it's fine.
Okay. Great. Well, first of all, thanks to all of you. I was also thinking through this as Lorenzo was talking about how to, something along the spectrum that's not quite so narrow is focusing on one single text, and then also that's not so broad as to kind of covering everything. And we do have kind of these constellations of traditions in the Apocrypha. I mean, there are, for example, within Coptic traditions, Apocrypha that are kind of uniquely Coptic, and they develop and are found in that tradition. Or you have kind of Syriac, Ethiopic, Arabic traditions that are kind of separate because they're later. And that might be one way of getting some breadth into a conference, so it's not so narrow, but also having it be manageable. And I mean, I think there's a lot of work to do kind of within these specific ecclesiastical or linguistic traditions, particularly Arabic and Georgian and the kind of Syriac, Ethiopic, Arabic traditions, and well, all of them really. But that, I mean, that might be one way of saying, you know, we can cast a net maybe slightly broader than one specific work, but not have it be a catch-all.
In any case, it's important that we are, even in the study of the Apocrypha, I mean, we are going much beyond the traditional discussion between Catholics and Protestants, because the problem of Apocrypha is not only a problem of it's not only part of that discourse. I mean, not only of the Orthodox churches, but also the Ethiopic Church, the Middle Eastern churches. I mean, these are things that usually we don't think about. Recently, I remember we ran and read. We are now publishing a book on another book on the receptionist of Enoch, and we have done a lot of effort. I mean, to go beyond the traditional narrative of the book lost in Europe, when in other parts of the world was never lost. So it's a little bit difficult, I mean, absurd to try to define everything from one single point of view. I see Gavin, Sara, John again, so Gern, Sara, and John.
Yes, I like all the ideas. I would like to add. Can you hear me?
Yes, yeah.
Oh, I would like to add maybe one more idea to it. In addition to, so to say, focusing on one specific book, maybe also on one specific period in history or a historical figure. For example, the years in which Salome Alexandra reigns would lead to various questions. Where do her ideas come from? What did people read in those days? Did they all have access to the Apocrypha and the Dead Sea Scrolls, or were there specific groups? How does it, so to say, interact? But also later receptions in various later traditions. So just as a possible other idea. And I'm myself very fascinated by Salome Alexandra.
You know, I've done some work on Judith, and so Salome Alexandra is it will be a very interesting topic. Sara.
Yes, thank you. One thing I appreciate most about Enoch Seminar events, even a book review panel, is that it always comes to stepping back and reflecting on the whole field itself, all of the fields, and pushing the conversation toward how we need to change, and what would allowing ourselves to dream about what the ideal would be. And almost every Enoch Seminar meeting, it comes down to, we need collaboration, we need interdisciplinarity, we need multiple perspectives, all the perspectives on each text. We need to break the boundaries down between canons, categories, Judaism and Christianity, Apocrypha, Pseudepigrapha, New Testament, Hebrew Bible. We always need to break those and look at things all together. But what keeps recurring for me is the barrier of the systems in which we work that are very much like a business model. We're really held back by, I don't know if it's a capitalist challenge or like a business model. The university has become such a business model where it's almost impossible to get interdisciplinary funding, for example, even inside your own institution, when your institution says, we want interdisciplinarity and collaboration, but it's very difficult to frame things in such a way because we do have silos. The disciplines are indeed siloed. But when I think about just the two lenses that inform my work the most, one is gender, the other is apocalypticism. When I know how much in my beliefs, no ancient text can be understood without checking on gender and checking on apocalypticism, because that always reveals more about the context, the text, the author, the audience, and that. And I know that all the specialisms that I don't have, those specialists have that same kind of knowledge. Like, if we don't look at this through sapiential, we won't fully understand. If we don't look at this text critically, we won't fully understand. If we don't bring global voices, we won't fully understand. If we don't look at embodied religion, ritual, we won't really understand. All of that is true. But how do we practically get to a place where we can actually collaborate, look at a text like Tobit, and have a gender lens, a disability lens, a text critical, a reception historical, attention to inner Jewish diversity, Jewish outsider dialogue, all of those things? How do we practically do it? I don't know. So that's my comment. It's a question. How do we achieve the ideal we constantly keep lifting up at Enoch Seminar of collaboration, interdisciplinarity, multidisciplinarity, and breaking down boundaries? I don't know.
That's a big question, Sara. I don't know. I know how we could not do it. I mean, because if we are isolating ourselves, I mean, even, I don't know, even if we promote a new approach to ancient text, and we do it only in this direction without interacting with the others, we are not doing a good service. I mean, we have to bring this new knowledge of it, this new comprehension of the text in the ordinary reading of a text. I mean, this is so. Maybe I know more what we should not do, but I agree. It's very hard to know how we could do. I mean, we have to listen to each other. We have to bring together people that are dealing with text in different ways, and be all together. I mean, listen to each other. Otherwise, none of us can do everything by itself or itself. I mean, we cannot do it anymore.
If there were ways for us to truly collaborate, we've never been in a better position, because at this point in history, we are so specialized. We have so many in-depth specialists that if we could form a collaborative entity and all workshop a text for some years, what would we come up with?
Kristin, I know that you like to add something on this.
Yes, just very quickly, this collaborative work and interdisciplinary work, we are also at this moment stimulating that in the European Academy of Sciences. And especially the last 2 years, we have been really working towards combining classes, science and arts, and the engineers with the people studying literature. So it is what we are now expressing, the need for a collaboration across the faculties and across the classes, is really what is new and what we need to set up.
John.
Just a side comment in terms of the economics of this actually is profound in terms of when you see the interdisciplinary projects at Helsinki, places like that actually demonstrate the relationship of economics and interdisciplinarity in a way that the American system has not been able to even imagine. That's a side comment. What I simply wanted to add to the agenda of the reception history project, and that's to, I mean, in Qumran studies, we become aware of the medieval disputes reflected in works like Kirkasani and other, and the rabbinite disputes with opponents in 9th, 10th century, rabbinic and Jewish writings. Go ahead a few centuries, you see Azaria de Rossi, again, dipping into those Jewish textual traditions. And I'm certainly not going to do it. But it seems to me that, that we haven't adequately explored that literature with regard to glimpses of reception history of both apocryphal and pseudepigraphic texts. Maybe there is more work than I'm aware of, but that strikes me as one other interesting stream. How much does this literature influence the various times in which we see resistance to the rabbinic center in Judaism at different times? Is the kind of question that would be interesting to know more about in the process of this reception history.
Thanks. Joshua.
Yeah, thank you. I posed a question at the end of the first session that still has been hanging over me, which is why I'd like to reintroduce it. It's a question of nomenclature that we're using to describe the Apocrypha. Is it rewritten text? Is it biblical? Is it non-biblical? It's one of the questions that I had as I was reading through this, and I was mindful of Carla Sulzbach's article about the relationship of the Apocrypha to rabbinic literature. And she brings up the categories of withdrawn books or outside books, according to the rabbinic perspective. I thought it was a really interesting comment about how the Apocrypha is received or not received in one specific religious tradition. My question is, coming away from this book as a conclusion of this work, how has our nomenclature changed about how we're referring to this collection of texts? Can we say anything? I don't want to say more definitive. I understand the fluidity of terms, but does this collected work actually shift how we're talking about the text itself?
Yeah, I think these are interesting questions. I don't know if anybody wants to say something. Okay, Ger.
Yeah, so I think I want to say a few things. The first is that we have the texts because they are in a collection which is related to a canon, although they're not canonical in that sense. So we should, in that sense, be grateful to the tradition that it has passed on this collection of writings. The second thing is also the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament are a collection of writings, but they are of course in addition also canonical. But from an historical point of view, they are a collection of very diverse writings that often have nothing to do with each other and come from all kinds of different periods and very different groups. And they don't really have a shared worldview, although from a canonical perspective, they have or have to have. Yeah. And the third point is, and that I think is the difference and makes it more complicated, whereas the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament as canon still have a present-day faith community that is connected to it and inspired by it. That is the big difference with the Apocrypha. They have similar functions as the canonical text, but they don't have a faith community. Yeah, they are, so to say, free floating around in the universe, looking for audiences and finding it in every center, including our own, but they don't have a church or a synagogue that takes care of them. And the only people who take care of them are we, you know? So we are, so to say, the faith community that wants to pass on the Apocrypha to a next generation. And yeah, that's maybe not an answer.
Catholic, I mean, for a Catholic or Orthodox, these are Bible.
Yeah, right. No, of course, for the Catholic canon, it's different, and that's why I started with praising those who have handed this over to us. That is a wonderful thing, you know. If they hadn't done that, and of course not only they, but also Oriental and Ethiopic churches have done similar things. Without that, it would have been lost. Yeah, but many in the West, Protestant secular, have a different angle to it, and they still are inspired by it, and that includes us. So.
I see Brandon and Michael. Brandon.
Yeah, my response to Joshua's question is, I think this is where we have to move back and forth between the local and the more general, right? The local and the global, because any particular community will have a different terminology for this, or if not terminology, at least a different view of it. So to the point that was just made about, you know, in Catholic tradition, if you were to plop down in the middle of England, say in the 12th century, they wouldn't have a conception of these texts. I mean, an average person wouldn't have a conception of the Apocrypha as being any different from the Bible. In fact, I don't think they would have a conception of biblical and pseudo-biblical stories as being altogether different anyway. Maybe some highly educated priests would, because they would be familiar with the discourse of the Bible and Apocrypha that had been transmitted with people like Jerome and Augustine's comments. But they would have conceived of all of this as biblical story, right? The part of the biblical history, part of the biblical world, part of their theology. But that's different for another community, right? I tend in my own work, when I'm talking about medieval people, to talk about Apocrypha very differently. And I tend to use the term Apocrypha as anything that's related to the Bible through subjects or attributions or things like that, but isn't part of a canon. But I would include the deuterocanonical books as part of that canon. So there's a very different way we're talking about it when we're talking about something like Western Europe. Whereas in early Christianity, who knows what they were thinking about these books, because for some early Christian communities, they would have accepted the deuterocanonical books, for others they wouldn't. But the same is true, for example, of Jude or Revelation, or pick any other Christian part of the New Testament, and those would have been accepted by some and not by others. I mean, just think about Gnosticism, for example. Even that has been broken down, and the category of Gnosticism has been questioned. And so how can we talk about these things has both epistemological and heuristic kinds of problems attached to it? And I think that the only way to overcome those is to constantly be aware of what we're talking about when we look at a local context, and then what's the larger global context, and how do those things go together, and what's the relationship between those things. It's really tricky, actually. It makes generalizing both like difficult and probably anathema, but also how do we talk about anything if we can't generalize or be able to make summary kinds of statements, right? And I don't know what I think to me that's the big tension, and I don't know how to overcome that tension when we talk about terminology or epistemologies or heuristics. How do we overcome those tensions of like, what do these categories gain us? Do they gain us anything? That's sort of where I get stuck on it.
Thanks. Michael.
First of all, I'd like to thank everyone for this excellent seminar, and just a great discussion, and also for the fine work that everybody has done in this volume, particularly Gerben. And what I'd like to just take up is just I'll describe an episode that I had to indicate maybe an avenue that is implied in our present conversation that we might pursue. It was in December. I've done lots, as probably many of you have, a lot of work in Jewish Christian conversations, collaborations. And in December, I was invited by the local Reform Synagogue to give a presentation on my work for the Sabbath prayer. So I was talking to the congregation about 2nd Maccabees. Of course, this is literature they had never heard of. And it's kind of a microcosm of how, when we talk about the actual text and the reception history, I do think, just to emphasize a point that's implied and explicit in many of your comments, it's so important to look at the reception history in Judaism. Furthermore, what I have found, and for instance, that evening, I have found, and subsequent to it, these are all friends. I attend the synagogue as well as go to a church, by the way. And I would take my students to the synagogue to make, if they were studying what we call New Testament, so that they would be in the ethos that is continued, the environments that are presumed there. But the thing that I would just mention is that it's so important for our work now to invite perspectives that are outside of our purview that are related to the global context. So for instance, within a conversation within synagogue, you're bound to talk about the current issues in Israel related to Palestinians and Israel, the issues related to the local community, and we're doing very well in Canada, but in many places you have a very strong uprising of anti-Judaism. I think all of this ties into the importance of the work that we are doing with the Apocrypha, and with us identifying what the Apocrypha is really all about. Because this is basic to what everyone would say, is the Apocrypha is all about Jewish identity. As we look, if we're looking for common ground, please debate that if you wish. But then when we're looking at reception history, it's so important for us to regain the understanding of the lack of reception history of many of these books within Judaism, and to look at the apocryphal literature in light of the canon of scriptures that the rabbis formulated as the Tanakh. What was going on, what was at stake there, and how can we recover the issues of Jewish identity and Jewish ethos more fully and bring it into the conversation, certainly within churches East and West, and thank you for mentioning the churches of the global world. But I think this would open up avenues that really merit exploration with a contribution that we who work in the Apocrypha can make really to the community at large. I'll stop there, but thank you very much for this wonderful opportunity for us to talk about these things.
Thank you. We are now approaching the end of our meeting. Esther, would you like to add something, some comments about from the discussion that we had? And then I will give to Gern the last word. Yeah. I was just asking if you have some final comments.
I don't have thoughts other than it's so exciting to see this conversation taking place, and I'm reflecting on the comments that Kristin made, although unfortunately she's gone now, and how I wanted to say I appreciate the work that she's done elsewhere in other texts on the feminist receptions of Esther. And so I think it's interesting and maybe a little ironic that she's the one who said, "Oh, mea culpa, I'm sorry for not including this." Like, you're doing this work, don't worry.
Somebody does it, it means that cares about it.
Yes. So I just hope that both the excellent message that Brandon had and the comments that I had are able to resonate in some way with folks as they do future scholarship. That's really all.
Thank you. Brandon, do you have also a very quick final word? And then I will ask Gern to say a final word to conclude our meeting.
I think I've said it enough. I would just echo how exciting it is. You know, like Esther said, and like Sara said, it's really exciting to be in a community of scholars who really want to talk about and wrestle with these things, and knowing that that's where the future of scholarship is. You know, like I said in my comments, it makes me really hopeful about the field. There are a lot of things to sort of despair about in academia, and it's being in these conversations that gives me a lot of hope and excitement.
Yes, and from my part, I mean, I think it's important. Remember again when we first discussed your book, and I said it's extremely important. I'm very glad that this book came out. We should do something, okay, to revive the study of the Apocrypha, because this is such an important group of tests. I mean, a body of tests. At the same time, we have to do it in a new way. I mean, in a way that is more in line with the new understandings of our approach to ancient text. I mean, giving more room to reception history, to problems that were not explored before. And I told you, let's have in the first meeting so that we can learn a little bit more about what we could do. I mean, having some ideas, and I think the conversation that we had today certainly have given us some ideas. I mean, some perspective for future research. I mean, for future events, etc. At least at the meanwhile, remind us that no matter what we'll do, we will have always to ask ourselves if we have also considered this literature, because it cannot be excluded by anything that is done about the Second Temple period. So, first of all, thank you to you, Gern, and to all of you that have contributed to this volume, also because it's a very important reminder of the importance of this material. Thanks, Gern, again. This is so. I'm giving to you the opportunity to close our conversation today.
Yes, I also want to end with a word of thanks to all of you. Editing is 95% desk work, and it's wonderful to have a live meeting and dialogue with real people, and in person will come, I hope, soon too. And of course, it was especially beautiful because it was part of the Enoch seminar. So in a true Enoch seminar spirit of exchange of ideas and projects for the future. And I think that is the best outcome of this book review, that first of all, it is back on the agenda of research. And I think second, we have, and thank you also for the reviewers for their constructive criticism. We have ideas for the future, and we have underlined the importance of that. So thank you for everything to everyone, and hope to see you soon again.
Yeah, thank you. And a final word of thanks, of course, to Joshua, who is the one who is responsible for the review service at the Enoch seminar, for organizing such a wonderful presentation. We all know, I mean, we have all learned at the Enoch seminar that when you have a nice result, it's because there has been a lot of work before. Okay, things are not improvised. Okay, so a lot of work has been done by Gern and by the authors of the volume, and a lot of work has been done also in organizing this. And I like what you said. I mean, this presentation has been done in the spirit of Enoch seminar. I mean, we all are enjoying this kind of spirit, because it makes us think. I mean, I like this kind of creative meetings. I mean, we are not simply reviewing or criticizing merciless what you have done in this case, but we are taking as an opportunity to reflect on a next step. I mean, because after all, I mean, any work that is done is a step in a long voyage. I mean, so and we have to use it exactly as an opportunity. I mean, to do more and to explore and to go beyond. I mean, from what has been accomplished already from this volume. So thanks very much for this opportunity. We will certainly continue this conversation in the months and years to come, because has opened some very interesting perspectives. So let's be creative. If you have some ideas, you will always find the Minox seminar a listener. I mean, a very interested listener. Thank you, Josh, again, and thank you all.
Bye, everyone. Thank you for joining today.